In 1993, David Lewis was a man who seemed to have it all. He was a successful and well-respected lawyer living in Amarillo, Texas. He had a loving wife, Karen, and a beautiful 9-year-old daughter. By all accounts, he was a devoted family man, the kind of guy who coached his daughter's sports teams and spent his free time helping out with local charities. His life was stable, predictable, and happy. On January 28th of that year, a Thursday, Karen and their daughter were getting ready for a fun weekend trip. They were heading to Dallas, a few hours away, for a mother-daughter shopping spree. It was something they were both really looking forward to. Normally, David would have tagged along, making a family trip out of it. But this particular weekend was a big one for sports fans. The Super Bowl was on that Sunday, the 31st, and David didn't want to miss it. He was a huge fan and wanted to enjoy the game from the comfort of his own home. So he said his goodbyes, and Karen and their daughter drove off to Dallas, leaving David to have the house to himself for a couple of days. They had their trip, and then on Sunday, after the big game had finished, they made the drive back home to Amarillo. As they pulled into the driveway, they were expecting to walk in and find David either cleaning up some game day snacks or maybe watching the post-game analysis. When they stepped inside, the house was quiet. The first thing Karen noticed was that the TV was still on, tuned to the channel that had just aired the Super Bowl. That wasn't too strange. But David was nowhere to be found. Karen called out his name, but there was no answer. She walked through the familiar rooms of their home, a little confused but not yet worried. She figured maybe he had gotten a last-minute invitation to watch the second half at a friend's house and just hadn't called. She noticed the VCR was still recording. This was classic David. He was known for recording all the major sporting events so he could watch them again later. The fact that the VCR was still running meant he hadn't been the one to turn it off. It was just another small, slightly odd detail. Karen continued her search, calling his name. She went into the kitchen, and that's when things started to feel a little more unsettling. She opened the refrigerator door, maybe looking for a note, or just seeing what was inside. And there, on a shelf, was a plate with 2 freshly made turkey sandwiches. This was a sandwich David made all the time, his go-to snack. But why would he make 2 sandwiches and then just leave them in the fridge, uneaten? It didn't make sense. She closed the fridge door and turned around. On the kitchen counter, she saw something that made her pause. It was David's wedding band and his watch, just sitting there. Now, this was truly strange. A man might forget his wallet, but leaving behind his wedding ring and his watch was different. It felt personal. Still, Karen tried to rationalize it. There were no signs of a break-in. Nothing was stolen or out of place. There was absolutely no evidence of a struggle. The house was exactly as it should be, just without David in it. Her best guess was that he had simply stepped out in a hurry and would be back soon. So, Karen waited up for a while, but as the hours ticked by, she eventually went to bed, telling herself he would surely be there in the morning. But when she woke up the next day, the other side of the bed was still empty. David had not come home. Now, real worry began to set in. The strange little details from the night before suddenly felt much more sinister. She knew something was wrong. She called the police and reported her husband missing. The Amarillo police began their investigation immediately. It didn't take them long to find a major clue. Within 24 hours, they located David's car. It was parked and abandoned in a downtown lot not far from the courthouse where he often worked. When they searched the vehicle, they found his keys, both for the car and the house, tucked away under one of the floor mats. Inside the car, everything seemed to be in order. His checkbook was there. His credit cards were in the glove compartment. His driver's license was right where it should be. Nothing of value had been taken. Investigators then looked into his recent financial activity, and that's when the story took another strange turn. They saw he had recently made a deposit of $5,000 into the family bank account. That seemed more like someone planning for their family's future than someone in trouble. But then they found something else. He had also recently purchased 2 one-way plane tickets. One was from Los Angeles to Dallas, and the other was from Dallas back to Amarillo. Police couldn't determine if he had actually used these tickets, but it added to a growing theory that maybe David had chosen to disappear. When the police presented all of this to Karen, the abandoned car, the untouched valuables, the bank activity, she told them something that changed the entire direction of the investigation. She said that just before he disappeared, David had told her that he believed his life might be in danger. He was scheduled to give a deposition in Dallas later that month. It was for a complicated conflict of interest case involving his old law firm and one of their very wealthy, very powerful clients. According to Karen, David was being heavily pressured by his former colleagues to lie to cover up some of the firm's wrongdoings. But David was an honest man. He had told his family that he was going to tell the absolute truth in his deposition, no matter whose reputation it destroyed. He knew this decision would make him a lot of enemies. He understood that telling the truth put a huge target on his back. This information was a bombshell. The police were certainly intrigued. It painted a picture of a man caught in a dangerous situation, not one who would just walk away from his family. But the problem was, it was just a story. They had no hard evidence to support the idea that someone was actively trying to silence David Lewis. It was a compelling theory, but without proof, it was just that, a theory. For the next 11 months, investigators followed every lead they could find. They interviewed his former colleagues. They looked into the wealthy client from the lawsuit, but they found nothing. No new information surfaced. There were no sightings of David. He never called home. He never used his credit cards or his social security number. He had, for all intents and purposes, vanished from the face of the earth. After nearly a year with no progress, the police officially decided to close the case. The official conclusion was that David Lewis had left of his own accord. They ruled out foul play. For David's family, this was a devastating blow. They had to try and accept the unacceptable, that David was gone, and they would likely never know what truly happened to him. The years passed, and the mystery of his disappearance remained a painful, open wound. Then, in 2004, 11 years after David vanished, something incredible happened. A state trooper in Washington state was sitting at his computer browsing the internet. He had an interest in unsolved mysteries and was looking through old cold cases. He clicked on a page and a picture of David Lewis popped up on his screen. The trooper stared at the photo. He felt an immediate jolt of recognition. The face looked exactly like an unidentified victim from a hit-and-run case he had worked on way back in 1993. His heart pounding, he pulled up the old case file. The details matched up in a chilling way. The John Doe victim had been struck by a vehicle and killed just one day after David Lewis was reported missing in Texas. The man had been found on the side of Highway 24 inches, rural Washington state, a staggering 1,600 miles away from Amarillo. When he was found, this John Doe was dressed from head to toe in military-style clothing. He had no wallet, no identification, and no luggage or bags of any kind. He was just walking aimlessly down the side of a remote highway. Despite the immense distance and the strange circumstances, the trooper felt a growing certainty that this was David. But as he looked back at the picture of David Lewis, he noticed David was wearing glasses. He tried to remember if the John Doe from 1993 had been wearing glasses, and he didn't think so. It was a small detail, but it could be the one that proved him wrong. Just to be sure, he checked the evidence log, the list of personal belongings found on the body, and there it was. The John Doe did have a pair of glasses on him. And when he saw the description, it was a perfect match to the exact same kind of glasses David was wearing in his photo. It wasn't long before DNA testing was done, and the results came back as a definitive match. The John Doe from Washington was without a doubt David Lewis. After 11 long years, the mystery of where David went was finally solved. But it only opened up an even bigger, more disturbing mystery. Why? Why would David travel 1,600 miles to Washington, a state where he had no friends, no family, and no connections whatsoever? If he was the one who hit the record button on his VCR on Super Bowl night, that meant he had less than 24 hours to get from Amarillo, Texas, to that remote highway in Washington. He did it without his car, without his credit cards, and seemingly without any luggage. Where did the military clothing come from? Did he buy it? Or did someone make him wear it? What was he doing walking down that highway in the middle of nowhere? David's family has always believed that he was a victim of foul play. They believe his own words to his wife that his life was in danger because of the testimony he was about to give. They believe someone abducted him from his home, drove him across the country, and killed him, staging it to look like a random accident. But officially, the case remains closed. The police maintain that David Lewis left his home voluntarily, and his death on that lonely highway was nothing more than a tragic accident. In the year 2000, Mary Lou Morris was a 48-year-old woman living a quiet life in Houston, Texas. She worked as a loan officer at a Chase bank and was happily married to her husband, Jay. On the morning of October 12th, a Thursday, everything seemed perfectly normal. Mary Lou said goodbye to Jay and left for her job at the bank, just like she did every other weekday. That afternoon, Jay decided to give his wife a call at work just to check in. But she didn't pick up her phone. He left her a voicemail, figuring she was just busy with a customer and didn't think much of it. But as the afternoon wore on and she didn't call him back, a small seed of concern started to grow. This was very out of character for Mary Lou. She always returned his calls. By 5 p.m., when Mary Lou should have been finishing up her workday, Jay still hadn't heard from her. He called her again, but once more, the call went straight to voicemail. Now his concern was turning into real worry. He decided to call Mary Lou's supervisor at the bank. The supervisor picked up, and Jay asked if he could speak to his wife. And the supervisor's response sent a chill down his spine. He told Jay that Mary Lou hadn't come into work at all that day. They had tried to get in touch with her as well, but couldn't reach her. In that moment, Jay knew something was terribly wrong. He immediately hung up and dialed 911, reporting his wife missing. The police had barely even started their search for Mary Lou when another call came into the station. It was from a man who had been riding his ATV on a remote dirt road about 3 miles from the Morris' home. He told the dispatcher that he had just stumbled upon a smoldering, burnt-out car, and he could see what looked like a body in the driver's seat. It turned out that the fire department had actually received a call earlier that day, around 10 inches the morning, about smoke being seen in that same area. But at the time, they had assumed it was just a controlled burn on someone's property, so they didn't send a unit out to investigate. When police and emergency services arrived at the scene, they found the car was completely destroyed by the fire. The body inside was so badly burned that it was impossible to visually identify who it was. Investigators carefully sifted through the wreckage, and they were able to find a small tooth fragment. They sent it off for testing, and soon their worst fears were confirmed. Dental records proved that the victim was indeed Mary Lou Morris. It was immediately clear to investigators that this was no accident. This was a homicide. They found evidence that gasoline had been poured all over Mary Lou and all over the interior of the car before it was set ablaze. It seemed the killer had tried to stage the scene, perhaps to make it look like a suicide or a tragic car fire. But because of the intense damage from the fire, the medical examiner couldn't determine an exact cause of death. They didn't know if Mary Lou was already deceased when she was placed in the car, or if the fire itself was what killed her. As police processed the scene, they noted that a number of Mary Lou's valuables, like her purse, were still inside the car. But one very important item was missing. Her wedding ring was not on her finger. The news of Mary Lou's brutal murder shocked her family and the entire community. She was known as a kind, gentle person who didn't have a single enemy in the world. No one could understand why anyone would want to hurt her. The day after her body was found, the case took another bizarre turn. A local Houston newspaper received a phone call from an anonymous man. All he said was, Mary Lou's death was an accident. The reporter on the line tried to press him for more information, asking who he was and what he meant, but the man simply hung up. The call was untraceable. At the exact same time this tragedy was unfolding for the Morris family, a completely separate drama was playing out for another woman in Houston. Her name, coincidentally, was also Mary Morris. This was 9-year-old. Mary McGinnis Morris. She was a successful and well-liked nurse practitioner. She generally got along with everyone at the clinic where she worked, with one notable exception. A new male nurse, a man named Dwayne Young, had recently started working there, and he was making her feel extremely uncomfortable. He seemed to have a problem with her for no apparent reason. One day, Mary McGinnis returned to her desk after seeing a patient and found something deeply disturbing. All of the framed photos of her family that she kept on her desk had been turned face down. And in the very center of her desk was a small piece of paper with 3 words written on it, death to her. She knew in her gut that it had to be Dwayne. But she had no proof. That night, she went home and told her husband Mike about what had happened. She told him about Dwayne and the note, and she said, I don't feel safe at work anymore. Can you teach me how to shoot a gun? Mike agreed. He took her to a range and taught her how to handle a firearm safely. He then bought her a small pistol, which she started keeping tucked under the driver's seat of her car, just in case. On October 16th, 4 days after Mary Lou Morris's body was found, and 3 days after that strange anonymous call to the newspaper, Mary McGinnis Morris finished her shift at the clinic and stopped at a drugstore on her way home. As soon as she walked inside, she noticed a man on the other side of the store who seemed to be watching her every move. She felt a wave of fear and immediately pulled out her cell phone and called her best friend, Lori. She described the strange man to Lori and asked what she should do. Lori told her to just wait, to pretend to shop until the man left the store. But the man didn't leave. He just stayed there, lingering in an aisle, staring at her. Finally, Mary McGinnis decided she couldn't wait any longer. She told Lori, you know what, I'm just going to pay for my stuff and get out of here. I have to make a quick stop by the office, but I'll be home in just a few minutes. I'll be fine. She hung up the phone, walked to the register, bought her items, and left the store. Just 12 minutes later, a frantic 911 call came in. It was Mary McGinnis Morris. The dispatcher could hear the sheer terror in her voice as she screamed that someone was trying to kill her. The contents of that 911 call have never been made public, reportedly because on the recording, you can actually hear the moment she is attacked. Later that night, Mary McGinnis was found in her car. She was deceased. She had a single gunshot wound to the head. It was clear from her terrified 911 call that this was a homicide. But just like with the first Mary Morris, her killer had attempted to stage the scene to look like a suicide. The murder weapon, which was her own pistol that she kept under her seat, had been carefully placed on the seat next to her hand. None of her valuables had been stolen from the car. But, just like Mary Lou Morris, her wedding ring was missing from her finger. After the murder of the second Mary Morris, police and the public began to speculate that these 2 cases had to be connected. It was just too much of a coincidence. 2 women, sharing the same name, living in the same city, murdered within days of each other. In both cases, the crime scenes were staged to look self-inflicted. and in both cases the victim's wedding ring was taken. A chilling theory began to form. This was a professional hit gone horribly wrong. The people who subscribed to this theory believed that Mary McGinnis Morris was the intended target all along, and that the murder of Mary Lou Morris was a tragic mistake. They reasoned that a hitman was hired, given the name Mary Morris and a general location, and he simply killed the wrong woman first. Then, upon realizing his mistake, he was the one who anonymously called the newspaper to say her death was an accident. And a few days later, the hit was successfully carried out on the correct target, Mary McGinnis Morris. The detail about the missing wedding rings supported this theory, as it's reportedly a common practice for hitmen to take a personal item like that to prove to their client that the job is done. Police took this theory very seriously and began looking into who might want Mary McGinnis Morris dead. Their attention quickly turned to her husband, Mike. They discovered that he had recently accused her of having an affair and was said to be extremely angry about it. He also behaved suspiciously after her murder, refusing to take a polygraph test and not allowing the police to interview his daughter. And then there was the motive. Mary McGinnis had a $700,000 life insurance policy, and Mike was the sole beneficiary. It seemed like a classic case of a husband hiring a hitman to kill his wife. But when investigators dug deeper, they couldn't find a single piece of evidence that tied Mike to either his wife's murder or the murder of Mary Lou Morris. As for her creepy coworker, Dwayne Young, who wrote the death to her note, police determined that while he clearly disliked her, he was not involved in her death. And so, both of these incredibly strange and tragic cases went cold. To this day, no one has ever been arrested or charged in either murder. In 1996, Blair Adams was a 31-year-old man living in Surrey, a suburb of Vancouver in British Columbia, Canada. In his past, he had some struggles with alcoholism and substance abuse, but for the last 2 years, he had completely turned his life around. He was clean, sober, and had landed a great job as a foreman for a local construction company. He was known as a friendly, cheerful guy who was easy to get along with and had no known enemies. But in the summer of that year, something changed in Blair. He started exhibiting strange and uncharacteristic mood swings. His mother would later describe them as being frequent and wild. In just a matter of weeks, the calm, relaxed, and friendly man she knew transformed into someone who was constantly panicked and on edge. He was always looking over his shoulder as if he expected someone to be following him. The stress was so intense that he couldn't sleep at night. He began telling his friends and coworkers that he was convinced someone was trying to kill him. They were concerned, telling him that he wasn't okay and that he really needed to see a doctor. When his mother confronted him about his increasingly erratic and paranoid behavior, he was secretive. He told her, "Mom, I really shouldn't tell you about it." She pressed him, asking, "What's it?" But he just shook his head and said, "I can't say anything else." And that was all she could ever get out of him. Blair's strange behavior reached a crisis point on Friday, July 5th. He went to his bank and withdrew his entire life savings in cash, a total of $6,000. He then went to his safety deposit box and emptied it as well. It contained thousands of dollars worth of gold, platinum, and expensive jewelry. It was the kind of thing someone does when they're planning to run. 2 days later, on Sunday, he got in his car and drove 30 minutes to the U.S. Canada border. He attempted to cross into the United States, but he was turned away. To the border guards, he was a collection of red flags. A single man traveling alone, carrying a large amount of cash and valuables, and acting extremely nervous. He fit the profile of a drug trafficker, and they denied him entry. Frustrated, Blair drove back home. The next day, Monday, he showed up at his construction site and walked straight into his boss's office. He abruptly announced that he was quitting, effective immediately. He didn't even bother to pick up his final paycheck. He just turned around and walked away. From the construction site, he went directly to the airport. There, he walked up to a ticket counter and purchased a round-trip ticket to Frankfurt, Germany for $1,600. No one knows for sure why he wanted to go to Germany, but he had worked there briefly the year before. His flight was scheduled to depart the following day, on Tuesday. But as soon as he bought the ticket, Blair seemed to change his mind again. He suddenly decided he needed to try and get into the United States one more time. He rushed from the airport to a female friend's house. When she opened the door, she was shocked by his appearance. He looked completely disheveled and terrified. He told her, "Someone's trying to kill me. I need your help. Can you drive me across the border? They just rejected me a couple of days ago. You have kids. It'll look more convincing if I'm with a family." His friend was seriously spooked by his frantic behavior and told him she couldn't help. So Blair went home and hid out for the rest of the day. The next morning, Tuesday, he went back to the airport. But instead of getting on his flight to Frankfurt, he went to the ticket counter and asked for a refund. He told the agent that the person he was supposed to meet in Germany had gotten sick, so he couldn't go. The only person this could have been was a woman he had a brief fling with while working there the year before. But later, when investigators spoke to this German woman, she told them she hadn't been in touch with Blair at all and was definitely not expecting him to visit. After getting his refund, Blair left the airport and went to a car rental agency where he rented a Nissan Altima. He immediately drove back to the U.S. Canada border, and this time, for whatever reason, he was allowed to cross. He drove south to Seattle, Washington, went straight to the airport there, and simply abandoned his rental car in the middle of a parking lot. He then went inside and bought a one-way ticket to Washington, D.C. The ticket cost him $770. He could have bought a round-trip ticket for about half that price, but he specifically chose the more expensive one-way option. He boarded the plane that night, and by Wednesday morning, he was on the other side of the country in Washington, D.C. As soon as he got off the plane, he rented another car, this time a Toyota Camry, and started driving again. He drove 500 miles southwest to Knoxville, Tennessee. Blair wasn't seen in Knoxville until around 5:30 that evening when he pulled into a gas station. He told the attendant that he was having trouble with his car. The attendant came out to take a look, and he immediately figured out the problem. Blair was trying to start his Toyota Camry with the key to the Nissan Altima he had abandoned in Seattle. The attendant pointed this out, but Blair, clearly confused, held up the key and insisted, "No, this is the one I was using." The attendant pointed to the Nissan logo on the key. Together, they searched the car inside and out, looking for the missing Toyota key, but it was nowhere to be found. Blair tried calling the rental company, but their office was already closed for the day. The gas station attendant told him there was nothing more he could do and that they would have to tow the car. But he offered to give Blair a ride to a nearby hotel. Blair accepted. Just after 6 p.m. that night, Blair walked through the front doors of a Fairfield Inn. Hotel security footage captured what happened next. He walked in, stood in the lobby for a moment, then turned around and walked right back out. A few minutes later, he walked in again, and then walked out again. He did this over and over 5 separate times over the course of an hour. Finally, he approached the front desk and asked for a room. The front desk clerk later told police that Blair seemed completely paranoid. He was constantly looking over his shoulder and was visibly on edge the entire time. She gave him his room key, he paid in cash, and then instead of going up to his room, he turned around, walked out the front door one last time, and never came back. The next morning, 2 construction workers arrived at their job site, which was located in a vacant lot directly across the street from the Fairfield Inn. As they started their day, they discovered a body. It was Blair Adams. He was lying on the ground, and strangely, he was missing his shoes, his socks, and his pants. He had several scratches on his hands and face, but none of the injuries were life-threatening. Scattered on the ground all around his body was $4,000 in a mix of American, Canadian, and German currency. His fanny pack, full of all the expensive gold and jewelry from his safety deposit box, was also lying nearby. A black duffel bag containing maps and travel receipts was on the ground. And also, lying in the dirt, was the missing key to the Toyota Camry. An autopsy was performed, and the medical examiner determined that Blair had died from a single massive violent blow to his stomach that had ruptured his organs. They had no idea what could have caused such an injury. A toxicology report came back clean. There were no drugs or alcohol in his system. The only piece of forensic evidence found at the crime scene was a single long strand of hair that Blair was found clutching tightly in his fist. There were no witnesses to the attack, but a security guard at a nearby business reported hearing a woman's scream coming from the direction of the lot at around 3:30 that morning. The only real lead police had was a composite sketch of a man who several people had seen Blair talking to outside of a Cracker Barrel restaurant shortly after he had left the hotel for the final time. But police were never able to identify this man. Investigators were completely baffled. Was Blair telling the truth all along? Had someone been hunting him for weeks, finally catching up to him in a vacant lot in Tennessee? If so, why didn't they take the thousands of dollars in cash and valuables that were lying right next to his body? Or was Blair suffering from a severe paranoid delusion, and his death was the result of a random, tragic encounter with a violent stranger? To this day, we still have no idea. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Robert Nishimoto was 71 years old, and he was the kind of person who really appreciated the quiet, simple moments in life. He spent most of his professional career working as a professor of sociology at the University of Southern California. For decades, he was deeply dedicated to his students, his research, and the university community. But when the time finally came for him to retire, he knew exactly where he wanted to spend the rest of his days. Robert decided to move back home to Hawaii. He wanted to spend his twilight years close to his friends and family, enjoying the beautiful tropical breeze, the warm sun, and the peaceful, slow pace of island life. He bought a lovely home with a large backyard and settled into a comfortable, happy routine. On Saturday, November 2nd, 2019, Robert woke up feeling particularly motivated. He looked out his window at his backyard and decided that today was the day he was going to tackle a major outdoor project he had been putting off for a while. His front lawn and the main part of his grass were in excellent shape because he took care of them on a regular basis. But the very back of his property had become completely overgrown. It was a wild mess of thick bushes, heavy shrubs, and tall trees that had not been trimmed in a very long time. Robert figured that on this beautiful Saturday morning, he would head out there and finally clean all of it up. So, he went to his tool shed, gathered up his pruning shears, his handsaw, his gardening gloves, and his other yard working tools, and walked out to the back of his property to get to work. Throughout the day, his neighbors saw him out there. They watched him slowly making progress, hacking his way through the thick branches and clearing out the dense weeds. By the evening, it looked like he was almost finished with the massive job. He had done an incredible amount of physical work, and everything seemed perfectly normal. He waved to a neighbor, packed up some of his things, and went about his evening. But fast forward 2 days later, to Monday, November 4th, Robert had a close group of friends that he met with all the time. On this particular Monday, his friends were sitting at their favorite restaurant in town, waiting for Robert to show up for lunch. This lunch meeting was a regular routine for them, and they always looked forward to catching up. But as the clock ticked past their scheduled meeting time, Robert was nowhere to be seen. One of his friends pulled out his phone and sent Robert a quick text message asking where he was. There was no reply. They waited and waited, watching the door, but Robert never walked in. After waiting for almost an hour and a half at the table, his friends started to get really worried. You see, Robert was not the type of guy who would ever blow off a lunch meeting without telling anyone. He was incredibly reliable and valued his friendships deeply. In fact, he was usually the first person to show up at the restaurant, and he would often tease the others for being even a few minutes late. For him to just not show up and not answer his phone was completely out of character and highly alarming. So, the friends decided they would get in their cars and drive by Robert's house just to make sure he was doing okay. But as they turned onto his street, they realized something was very wrong. Down at the end of the road, right in front of Robert's house, there were fire trucks, police cars, and a massive amount of commotion. It turned out that nobody had seen or heard from Robert since Saturday evening when he was out in his yard. His family had been trying to call him all weekend to check in, but they could not get a hold of him. Their calls went straight to voicemail, and their texts went unread. Finally, on Monday, right around the time his friends were waiting at the restaurant, Robert's family had called the local police department to ask them to do a welfare check on him. When the police officer arrived at the house, he walked up to the front door and knocked loudly. There was no answer. He tried the door handle, but it was locked tight. So the officer walked around to the side of the house and made his way into the backyard, searching for any signs of life. He walked up to the back door and knocked again. Still, there was no answer. But as the officer stood there, he noticed that the back door was actually slightly open, leaving a small gap. He pushed the door open, stepped onto the threshold, and yelled inside, calling out Robert's name. No one replied. The officer decided to step inside to look around and make sure Robert was not hurt or in need of emergency medical help. He walked through the home, going room by room, checking the kitchen, the living room, and the bedrooms. Everything was neat and tidy, just as Robert always kept it. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication of a break-in, and absolutely no sign of Robert. The officer went back out the back door and stood in the yard, looking around the property. He decided to walk toward the very back of the yard where Robert had been clearing the brush. As he approached the edge of the cleared area, he noticed that some of Robert's yard tools were just lying flat on the grass, as if they had been dropped suddenly. And right next to those tools, there was a strange indentation in the ground. It looked like a small, shallow divot, as if the soil had sunk slightly. The officer was intrigued and a bit concerned, so he started walking across the lawn toward the tools and the divot. As he got closer, he noticed there was a tiny, dark hole right in the center of that indentation. The officer walked up to the very edge of the divot and peered down into the tiny hole, trying to see what was underneath. And then, without any warning, the ground beneath his feet began to give way. The earth collapsed inward, and the tiny hole suddenly turned into a wide, gaping opening about 2 feet across. The officer reacted on pure instinct, jumping backward to keep from falling into the sudden void. He stood there for a moment, his heart pounding, waiting for the ground to stop sliding and settling. Once everything was completely still, he cautiously crept back to the edge of the hole. He took out his flashlight, turned it on, and shone the beam down into the opening. But the light just faded into the darkness. He could not see the bottom at all. It was clear that this was an incredibly deep, vertical shaft. The officer carefully took a few more steps forward, testing the ground with his boots to make sure it was solid and would not collapse under his weight. Finally, he got to a spot where he could aim his light straight down. And that was when his flashlight beam hit the bottom, 22 feet below. Lying there on the floor of the dark chamber was Robert's body. It turned out that Robert had fallen into a hidden lava tube. In big cities, people might worry about falling into open manholes, but in certain parts of Hawaii, the real danger is falling into lava tubes. These tubes are formed during volcanic eruptions. As hot, molten lava flows down the side of a volcano, the top layer of the lava is exposed to the air. That top layer begins to cool and harden, forming a solid crust or shell over the flowing lava underneath. The lava underneath keeps moving, sometimes for months, until it completely drains out. When it is empty, it leaves behind a massive, hollow subterranean tunnel. Over decades and centuries, nature reclaims the land on top of these tubes. Grass, bushes, and trees grow over them, making the ground look completely solid and normal. But right beneath that thin crust of earth is a giant, empty space. Robert had fallen through what is known as a skylight. A skylight is a place where the thin ceiling of a lava tube has weakened over time and left a small hole. In highly populated or touristy areas of Hawaii, these skylights are well known, clearly marked, and blocked off so people do not fall in. But if you go off the beaten path into areas that do not get much foot traffic, you can easily run into an undiscovered skylight. And in Robert's case, his backyard was so overgrown with thick brush and plants that the greenery had completely covered the hole. To Robert, it looked like he was standing on solid ground. In reality, he was standing on a fragile shelf of dirt and roots over a 22-foot drop. While he was working, the ground simply gave way, and he fell to his death. It was a tragic and sudden end to a peaceful retirement. Now, we are going to move from the quiet islands of Hawaii to the deep blue waters off the coast of the Dominican Republic, where we find another individual who pushed the limits of where humans are supposed to go. Her name was Audrey Mestre. Audrey was 28 years old, a French native, and she was one of the most talented free divers in the entire world. Freediving is already considered one of the most dangerous and extreme sports on the planet. For most people, freediving just means swimming underwater without a scuba tank. But for elite athletes like Audrey, it is a completely different world. They take a single massive breath of air on the surface, and then they dive down to mind-boggling depths, staying underwater for minutes at a time before returning to the surface. Within this already extreme sport, there is an even more extreme version called no limits. Instead of the diver taking a big gulp of air and then using their own physical strength to swim down or pull themselves down on a rope, in no limits free diving, the divers are allowed to use whatever equipment they want to get as deep as they can possibly handle. The only rule is that you cannot use a breathing apparatus. The most common no limits technique is to grab hold of a heavy metal sled that is connected to a bottom-weighted vertical cable. The free diver holds onto the sled, and it is released from the surface. The sled rockets down into the deep ocean to whatever their desired depth is, and the diver just holds on tight. Once they reach the bottom of their descent, the diver turns a switch or a valve which shoots compressed air into a big balloon attached to the sled. Once the balloon is filled enough, the buoyancy pulls the sled and the diver, who is hanging on, back up the cable to the surface. Normally, a no-limits freedive using this technique takes approximately 3 minutes from start to finish. The reason no limits is considered such an extreme version of freediving is because it allows divers to reach extraordinary depths that they physically are not capable of getting to on their own. We are talking about over 100 meters below the surface. There is just no way a person can swim down that deep and back up on a single breath of air without the help of the sled and the balloon. Because of this, if your equipment fails at those extreme depths, it is almost always fatal. On October 12, 2002, Audrey was sitting on a floating platform off the coast of the Dominican Republic, mentally preparing herself for what she was about to do. She was trying to become the best free diver in the world by breaking the world record for the deepest depth achieved by a no-limits free diver, which was 170 meters. That record was actually held by her husband, a famous diver named Pippin Ferraris. But as she sat on that platform, doubt must have crept into her mind because storm clouds began to roll in and the water became rough. In the world of no-limits freediving, where so many things can go wrong, there is no reason to add in another risk factor like bad weather. It could affect the support team on the surface, and it could affect the stability of the cable. On top of that, Audrey was using a new piece of equipment. She had a slightly thinner, lighter cable that her sled was attached to, but she did not know how it would perform on a dive this deep. Furthermore, Pippin, who was in charge of safety for the dive, had been heavily criticized in the diving community. Many felt he was rushing this record attempt and had not done enough preparations. There were not enough medical staff on site, and there were not enough standby divers positioned along the cable. Audrey was well aware of these criticisms. Pippin was regularly criticized because 6 years earlier, 2 separate people on his staff had died during different diving accidents, and people accused him of being reckless. But despite all of these red flags, Audrey was incredibly confident and wanted to go through with the dive. She signaled to her team that she was ready. She zipped up her bright yellow wetsuit, checked her sensors and video cameras, and put on her long fins. Meanwhile, Pippin checked the crucial balloon that would bring her back up. Because this piece of equipment was so vital, Pippin insisted that he was the only one who could touch it, even though normal safety procedures required at least 2 other people to inspect it before a dive. Regardless, Pippin inspected the balloon and determined it was good to go. He signaled to Audrey, and she slipped off the platform into the water, swimming over to the 200-pound sled. Just before she gave the final go-ahead, she performed a procedure called packing, taking a deep breath and gulping down extra air to pack her lungs full. Then, she gave the signal. The sled was released, and she began rocketing down into the deep ocean. Audrey's descent was going perfectly until she hit the 164-meter mark. Because of the bad weather and rough water, the lightweight cable was swaying in the current, causing kinks to form in the line. The sled caught on one of these kinks and stopped. Audrey had to sit there in the dark for 30 seconds until the kink finally straightened out and she could continue down past the record mark of 170 meters. That 30-second delay might not have mattered if everything else went perfectly, but unfortunately, it did not. Once Audrey set the record by hitting 171 meters, she stopped the sled and reached over to turn the valve to inflate the balloon. She turned the switch, but nothing happened. The balloon did not inflate. On the camera footage, you can see a hint of panic in her body language. She was almost out of breath, pushing past her 3-minute limit, and needed to get to the surface immediately. She stayed calm and turned the switch again, but still, nothing happened. At this point, a standby diver noticed the sled was not moving and rushed over. He tried to manually inflate the balloon using his own auxiliary air tank, but there was not enough air coming out to fill it quickly. The sled began to move upward, but painfully slowly. You might wonder why the standby diver did not just give Audrey his regulator to let her breathe. But because she was so deep, the immense pressure had compressed her lungs to the size of small oranges. If she took even a tiny gulp of air at that depth, the air would expand so dramatically as she rose that it would have destroyed her lungs and killed her. All Audrey could do was cling to the sled, rise slowly, and try to hold her breath as long as possible. The video shows her remaining absolutely stoic as she rode the sled, knowing what was about to happen. On the surface, when she did not appear after 3 minutes, Pippin put on scuba gear and jumped in. By the time he reached her and brought her out of the water, she had been without air for 8 minutes and 40 seconds. She had a faint pulse when they put her on the boat, but there was no doctor on standby to treat her immediately. Pippin had also spent a few extra minutes trying to resuscitate her while they were still in the water, which delayed medical care. She was rushed to the hospital but was pronounced dead. The cause of death was drowning. While some believed Pippin had intentionally sabotaged the dive to protect his own record, the official investigation concluded that Audrey's death was a tragic accident. In 1993, after an exhaustive review of hundreds of potential sites across the United States, executives from the German car company Mercedes-Benz made a monumental decision. They announced that Tuscaloosa, Alabama, would become the site of their first ever passenger car assembly factory outside of Germany. This was an incredibly historic day, not just for the executives at Mercedes-Benz, but for the entire state of Alabama. At the time, Alabama had one of the highest unemployment rates in the nation, and residents were desperate for stable, well-paying work. They were hopeful that this new factory would create hundreds of jobs and give the local economy a much-needed boost. But what actually happened next far exceeded their wildest expectations. Immediately following the Mercedes-Benz announcement, three other major automotive giants, Toyota, Honda, and Hyundai, all made similar announcements. They revealed that they too would be setting up massive manufacturing shops in Alabama. These four major factories did not just bring their own assembly line jobs. They also attracted dozens of smaller factories that supplied the parts needed to build the cars. These supplier factories set up operations all across the state, bringing thousands of additional jobs with them. This single decision by Mercedes-Benz in 1993 ended up creating tens of thousands of new jobs all across Alabama, transforming the state into a massive automotive manufacturing hub. 2 years later, in 1995, a little girl named Regina Elsie was born just about an hour away from the Mercedes-Benz factory in Tuscaloosa. Growing up, the automotive manufacturing industry was a constant presence in her life. Many of her family members worked in the local factories, and as a child, she would sit outside and watch dozens of massive 18-wheelers go by. These trucks were always carrying car parts, heading down the highway toward one of the many assembly plants. Regina was a quiet, reserved, and incredibly sweet kid. She absolutely loved to read, she was an excellent student in school, and she had a deep love for animals. She was the kind of person who could not bear to see an animal suffering. Whenever she found a stray dog or cat in her neighborhood, she would immediately take it in and bring it back to her house to care for it. But of all the animals she rescued, her absolute favorite was her dog, whom she named Cow. Regina had big dreams for her future. She wanted to go to college, study medicine, and eventually become a pediatrician so she could help sick children. After she graduated from high school, she took her first step toward that dream. She enrolled in a local community college on a federal grant with plans to eventually transfer to Auburn University to finish her degree and then apply to medical school. But while she was attending community college, her life took a beautiful and unexpected turn. She fell in love with a local boy named Dan. Remarkably, Regina and Dan had actually known each other since kindergarten, but it was not until they were older that they realized they were meant to be together. Before long, the young couple got engaged and started planning their wedding. They were incredibly happy and wanted to take the next step by moving into a place of their own. But they ran into a very common and difficult obstacle. They simply did not have enough money. Regina was a full-time student, so she did not have any income coming in. Dan was working as a shelf stocker at the local Walmart, making barely above minimum wage. They quickly realized that they could not afford rent, utilities, and groceries on Dan's salary alone. The only way they could afford their own home would be if Regina dropped out of college and got a job too. This was an incredibly tough decision for Regina. She still desperately wanted to become a pediatrician, but at the same time, she was so excited about starting her life and her future with Dan. She thought about it long and hard, and she eventually told herself that she was only 20 years old. She figured she could take a break from her education, work for a few years to build up some savings with Dan, and then go back to school later to get her medical degree. So, in January of 2016, Regina made the difficult decision to disenroll from her classes and start looking for a full-time job. A month later, she landed a job as an assembly line worker at a car parts supplier factory called Agent USA, which was located in southeastern Alabama. This was a factory where her stepfather and one of her sisters were currently employed, and the company supplied parts directly to major car brands like Hyundai and Kia. When Regina told her mother about the new job, her mother was deeply concerned. Her mother had worked at 2 other similar auto parts supplier factories in the past, and she knew firsthand how brutal the environment could be. She warned Regina that it was not a great place to work, explaining that the physical pace was exhausting and the pressure to perform was almost unbearable. You see, car parts suppliers operate under an intense amount of stress. They have strict daily quotas that they must meet for their major clients. If they fail to deliver the required number of parts, even by a tiny margin, they can be hit with massive financial fines from companies like Hyundai and Kia. This immense pressure from the top often filters down to the factory floor, leading management to overwork their employees. Over time, the workers develop a production at all costs mentality. They see that their employers care far more about hitting numbers than anything else, and as a result, they start cutting corners and ignoring safety regulations just to keep the assembly lines moving. But when Regina's mother shared these warnings, Regina listened but insisted that she had no choice. She had bills to pay, and she was determined to build a life with Dan. By this time, she and Dan had moved into a small house in southeastern Alabama, not far from the Agent USA factory. They were living there happily with their beloved dog, Cow. Regina had also bought herself a brand new car, which she was incredibly proud of because she had paid for it with her own hard work. She had also gone shopping and found the absolute perfect wedding dress for her upcoming big day. It fit her beautifully and made her feel like a princess, but it cost $4,000. Because of all of these expenses, Regina was not about to walk away from this job. She needed the money to pay for her car, her rent, and her dream wedding dress. When she first started working at Agent USA, the company put her on temporary status, which meant she was only making $8.75 an hour. In order to make more money and help secure her future, she needed the company to transition her to full-time status. Becoming a full-time employee came with a wage increase of $1.75 per hour, which would make a huge difference for her and Dan. Regina was determined to prove to the management that she was a hard worker and deserved that full-time promotion. To show her dedication, she volunteered to work exhausting 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. For 6 months, she worked this punishing schedule, pushing her body and mind to the absolute limit. But by June of 2016, the constant exhaustion had finally caught up with her. She was completely over it. She drove to her parents' house, collapsed onto their couch, and tiredly told them that she just could not keep doing this anymore. She explained that she was going to start looking for other work, hopefully something part-time, so she could finally go back to school and resume her dream of becoming a pediatrician. Her family was incredibly relieved and excited to hear this, looking forward to seeing Regina get her normal life back. A few days later, on June 18, 2016, Regina went in to work what would be her final shifts at Agent USA. She was scheduled for the day shift, and her specific job that afternoon was to oversee a large automated robot. This robot's task was to weld metal pillars onto the front right and front left sides of car frames, which is where the side view mirrors are attached. The robot was a massive machine looking like a giant, powerful arm protruding from the concrete floor. At the very end of this robotic arm, where a hand would normally be, were 2 sharp welding tips that stuck out about 4 inches each. Because these automated arms move with incredible speed and force, the robot was surrounded by a tall, heavy chain-link safety fence. This cage was there for one reason: to prevent employees from getting anywhere near the machine while it was in operation. Regina's job was to monitor the robot's performance from a safe distance using a computer screen located outside of the metal cage. At some point during the afternoon, as Regina was watching her computer screen, an error message popped up. It indicated that there was a stud fault on Robot 23. Now, Robot 23 was not the machine that Regina was personally responsible for. It was the robot located right next to her station. But the person in charge of monitoring Robot 23 was a member of Regina's immediate work team. Because the entire team shared a single collective quota that they had to hit by the end of the shift, having Robot 23 shut down was a massive problem for everyone, including Regina. If the line stopped, their numbers would drop, and management would be furious. So Regina stepped away from her station and walked over to the safety cage of Robot 23. She spoke to her coworker, and they both agreed that the best course of action was to call the maintenance department and have them come over to clear the error code. A security camera inside the factory was pointing down at Regina's work area, capturing her and her coworkers as they stood outside the metal cage of Robot 23, waiting for help to arrive. But as the minutes ticked by, no one from the maintenance department showed up. It was clear from the security footage that the workers were becoming increasingly anxious. They knew that every single second the robot remained idle, they were falling further behind on their quota. They knew that failing to hit their numbers would result in severe reprimands from management and massive fines for the company. The pressure was building, and the stress was getting to them. At some point, Regina apparently decided that she could not wait any longer. She decided to take matters into her own hands and fix the issue herself. She picked up a small tool that looked like a screwdriver, walked over to the safety cage of Robot 23, opened the door, and stepped inside. She walked directly up to the main stem of the stationary robot. As she did, she turned her back to the massive robotic arm that was positioned right behind her. She leaned in and began using her small tool to work on the stem, trying to manually clear the fault. Whatever adjustment she made, it worked. But it worked too well. The moment she cleared the issue, the machine's computer registered that the fault was gone, and the automated system immediately triggered the robot to resume its task. The massive robotic arm behind Regina instantly sprang to life. It swept forward with incredible speed and force, performing the exact motion it had been trying to complete before it errored out. As the arm swung forward, those two 4-inch metal welding tips at the end of the arm were driven directly into Regina's upper back. The force of the impact was devastating. Her coworkers, who were standing just outside the cage, saw the horrific event happen in real time. One of them immediately lunged for the emergency shutoff switch and pressed it down. But the system did not cut power instantly. Before the robot completely shut down, the momentum of the arm thrust Regina all the way across the inside of the safety cage, pinning her violently against the metal wall. When the machine finally lost power and came to a complete stop, the two welding tips were still fully embedded in her upper back, holding her upright against the wall. She was literally pinned to the wall, suspended off the ground. It was a scene of absolute horror. Regina was conscious, and her eyes were wide open, but she did not make a single sound. She was in a state of profound shock and could not speak or scream. Her coworkers panicked, rushing to the cage door, but none of them knew how to manually release the robot's powerful mechanical grip without causing further injury or turning the machine back on. The team leader realized they needed help immediately. He ran out of the area, hopped onto a nearby forklift, and sped across the busy factory floor toward the break room. He burst through the doors, located a maintenance worker, and told him there was a terrible emergency. He dragged the maintenance worker out, but because they needed to get back as fast as possible, the maintenance worker had to sit on the team leader's lap as they sped back across the factory on the forklift. When they arrived back at the safety cage of Robot 23, the team leader pushed the maintenance worker toward the open cage door, telling him to get Regina down. But the situation immediately deteriorated. The maintenance worker did not speak any English. He was completely terrified by the horrific scene before him, seeing Regina pinned to the wall. He did not understand the frantic instructions the workers were shouting at him, and he had no idea how to safely disengage the robot under these extreme circumstances. As the seconds ticked by, tempers flared, and the panicked workers began shouting at him in frustration. Overwhelmed by the chaos, the fear, and the pressure of the moment, the maintenance worker simply turned around and ran away, leaving the workers on their own. By the time emergency medical crews finally arrived at the factory several minutes later, Regina was still pinned to the wall by the robot. She was still conscious, her eyes were still open, and she remained completely hauntingly silent. The paramedics and rescue workers were eventually able to carefully disengage the robotic arm and lower Regina to the ground. They rushed her to a local hospital, and due to the extreme nature of her injuries, she was quickly transferred to a major trauma center. But despite the best efforts of the medical staff, the damage done to her body by the metal welding tips was simply too severe. Regina died at the hospital, surrounded by her devastated family. An investigation into the tragedy was immediately launched by safety regulators, and what they uncovered was deeply disturbing. It was revealed that Agent USA had failed to properly train Regina or any of her coworkers on basic machine safety protocols. The company's unofficial policy was to hire temporary workers and get them onto the active factory floor as quickly as possible to keep production numbers up. Because of this rush, Regina and her team members had never been taught the vital lockout procedure. This is a standard safety protocol where, before anyone enters a robot safety cage, the power supply must be physically locked in the off position with a padlock. This ensures that even if a fault is cleared, the machine cannot accidentally turn back on while a human is inside the cage. Regina and her coworkers were completely unaware of this life-saving rule. All they had been taught was that the daily quota was the absolute most important thing, and that failing to hit it would have severe consequences. This high-pressure environment is what drove Regina to enter that cage, and it is ultimately what led to her death. Following her tragic passing, the state and federal safety agencies issued severe citations to the company. Agent USA ultimately pleaded guilty to failing to provide a safe working environment and failing to properly train their employees, which directly resulted in Regina's death. As part of the legal resolution, the company was ordered to pay a settlement of $1.5 million to Regina's grieving family. But no amount of money could ever make up for the loss of a bright, kind-hearted 20-year-old girl who had her entire life ahead of her. Her family was left to mourn the loss of a beloved daughter, sister, and fiancé, and her dog Cow was left waiting for an owner who would never come home. It is truly sobering to think about how quickly an ordinary, routine day can turn into a tragic fight for survival. Robert was just trying to clean up his backyard, hoping to enjoy his hard-earned retirement in peace, completely unaware of the fragile earth beneath his feet. Audrey was chasing her dream of becoming the absolute best in her sport, placing her trust in a team and equipment that ultimately failed her in her most critical hour. And Regina was just trying to build a beautiful life with her fiancé, working herself to the bone in a high-stress factory, only to be failed by the very company that was supposed to keep her safe. Their stories serve as a powerful and tragic reminder of how fragile life can be and how quickly the places we go can become traps from which there is no escape. And the terrifying part is, none of these people thought they were doing anything dangerous that day. They all believed they were completely safe right up until the moment everything went wrong. If you want more true stories like these, check out the next video on screen now. On the afternoon of the 25th of April 2007, a 25-year-old police officer named Martin Arnold and his partner Michelle were sitting in their police cruiser. They were parked in the lot of a public park in a city called Heilbronn in Germany. It was their lunch break. Martin was eating a sandwich, casually looking out across the park. The space was mostly empty, which made sense. It was a weekday afternoon, and most people were at work or school. Heilbronn was a medium-sized city in southern Germany, and for the most part, it was a pretty safe place to live. The worst crimes they usually dealt with were things like break-ins or the occasional mugging. So, for Martin and his partner, it was a pretty quiet day. There wasn't a whole lot of action happening around them. But there was something that Martin, Michelle, and basically every other police officer in Germany were constantly aware of. For the past 14 years, a whole series of crimes had been happening all across the country. These crimes ranged from simple home invasions and robberies to at least 2 brutal murders. And according to the DNA evidence collected at each scene, they had all been committed by the same person. It was a single woman, and the press had given her a nickname. They called her the Woman with No Face. For over a decade, she had managed to evade capture. And so, in a way, every police officer in Germany was always on the lookout for her. She was the most elusive, most sought-after criminal in the entire country. But on this particular afternoon, as Martin sat in his cruiser on his lunch break, he wasn't really thinking about the possibility of capturing the woman with no face. He was just thinking about his sandwich. He was about to take another bite when he heard a sound that made him freeze. It was the sound of the back doors of his cruiser opening. He whipped his head around to look, and what he saw sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. There were two people standing there, one at each of the open back doors, and each of them was holding a gun. Before Martin or Michelle could even process what was happening, before they could reach for their own weapons or even shout, the two people raised their guns. They fired. And for Martin, everything went black. Within minutes, the quiet park was swarming with police. Officers from the Heilbronn Police Department descended on the scene, their sirens cutting through the afternoon calm. They found Michelle first. She was deceased, killed by a single gunshot wound to the head. Then they saw Martin. He had also been shot in the head, but incredibly, he was still alive. He was unconscious, but breathing. An ambulance was called immediately, and paramedics rushed him to the hospital while detectives began the painstaking work of taping off the crime scene and looking for any piece of evidence they could find. Some of the officers started canvassing the area, going from bench to bench, path to path, hoping to find a witness. But it was no use. The park had been basically empty all day. There was nobody who had seen the shooting happen. Other officers got on their hands and knees, meticulously searching the ground around the police cruiser. They were looking for footprints, anything that might tell them which direction the shooters came from or where they went. They dusted the car for fingerprints, hoping for a stray print on a door handle or a window. They searched inside and outside the car for bullet casings, for hairs, for loose fibers from clothing, but there was nothing. It was as if the attackers had been ghosts. At this point, the investigators were completely stumped. All they knew for sure was that at least one shooter, maybe more, had managed to walk up to a marked police cruiser in broad daylight, completely undetected. They had opened the back doors, shot both officers in the head at point-blank range, and then vanished without leaving a single obvious trace behind. It seemed impossible. The investigators kept thinking they must have missed something. There had to be some small clue, something that could point them in the right direction, give them a lead on who was responsible for this brazen attack. In a last-ditch effort to find something, anything, at the crime scene, one of the forensic officers decided to swab the inside of the car for potential DNA evidence. It was a long shot. They knew that if they found any DNA, it could easily belong to Martin or Michelle. Or it could belong to anyone else who had recently been in the back of that cruiser. It didn't mean the DNA would belong to the shooters. But it was possible. It was their only shot. They wouldn't know if the sample was useful until the crime lab analyzed the swabs, and that process could take a very long time. But it was worth a try. And so they carefully packaged the swabs and sent them off for testing. While they waited for the DNA results to come back, the Heilbronn Police Department continued to work the case. They re-interviewed everyone who worked in or lived near the park. They checked traffic cameras. They followed up on every tiny tip that came in. But they kept coming up empty. Their only real potential witness was Martin himself, but he was still in a deep coma at the hospital, unable to tell them what he saw. Weeks turned into a month. The case was growing colder by the day. And then, finally, the police got the news they had been waiting for. The DNA results from the lab were in. And what those results revealed was so stunning that it sent the media into an absolute frenzy and instantly turned this local investigation into a national manhunt. Around this same time, in mid-2007, a 44-year-old German prosecutor named Gunther Horn was sitting in his office. He got a call from his boss, and his boss's voice was urgent. He said, "The woman without a face has struck again. This time in Heilbronn. Gunter's eyes went wide. He sat up straight in his chair and listened intently as his boss laid out the details. 2 police officers had been ambushed in their cruiser. One was dead, the other in a coma. And in the back seat of their car, forensics had found DNA. The DNA of the woman with no face. Gunter had always been fascinated by this particular case. The story of the woman without a face was legendary in German law enforcement circles. And so, he was beyond ecstatic when his boss asked if he, Gunter, would be willing to lead the investigation into this latest crime in Heilbronn. His new mission was not just to solve the shooting of the 2 officers, but to finally, once and for all, identify and capture this phantom killer. Gunter immediately said yes. He would do it. And he got to work right away. The first thing Gunter did was organize a special task force to investigate the woman without a face. The team was based in Heilbronn, but their scope was national. At Gunter's command, detectives on the team began a massive undertaking. They started reinvestigating all the old crimes from all over Germany that had been linked to this woman's DNA. They were looking for patterns, for overlooked evidence, for witnesses that might have been missed during the original investigations years ago. Through this exhaustive effort, the team started to build a rough profile of their suspect. They knew she was very likely a heroin user because police had once recovered a heroin needle with her DNA on it at a public park. They also knew she had extensive criminal contacts. Many of her crimes involved co-conspirators. But whenever police had managed to arrest and interrogate these co-conspirators, none of them would ever say a word about her. It was like they were terrified of her, loyal to her out of fear. There were a couple of other details that struck Gunter as being particularly odd. The first was the evidence itself. In 16 years of criminal activity, the only piece of evidence this woman had ever left behind at any of her dozens of crime scenes was her DNA. And since they didn't have a match for her in any database, they only knew she was a woman. They had no idea who she was. She had never left a single fingerprint. Not a footprint. Not a hair. Nothing else. It seemed like her crimes were incredibly deliberate, surgically clean, and meticulously planned. And yet, she was also consistently leaving behind her DNA. It was almost as if she was leaving it on purpose, like a calling card to taunt the police. The other strange thing Gunter and his task force discovered was that in many of the crimes committed by the woman without a face, witnesses had described seeing what looked like a man at the scene, not a woman. This was obviously weird. Based on the DNA evidence, they knew, unequivocally, that their suspect was biologically female. So Gunter had a couple of theories. Maybe this man seen at the crime scenes was just one of the woman's many co-conspirators. Or maybe the woman without a face was so cunning that she dressed as a man to avoid being identified and caught. But it was impossible to know for sure without a first-hand witness, someone who had actually seen the suspect up close. That was what Gunter really needed. And then, in late May, about a month after the shooting in Heilbronn, Gunter got a call about that exact type of witness he had been looking for. Later that same day, Gunter walked into a hospital in Heilbronn. He went to a specific room and saw police officer Martin Arnold lying in a hospital bed. His eyes were open. After being in a coma for a month, he had finally woken up. Gunter knew that Martin was his best, and maybe his only, chance of catching the woman without a face. Presumably, right before he was shot, he must have gotten a look at his attackers. He was the one witness who might finally be able to describe her. Gunter walked over, pulled up a chair next to Martin's hospital bed, and he gently asked him to please just tell him everything he remembered about what happened that day in the park. Martin was clearly distraught. He had just woken up from a coma to learn that his partner and friend, Michelle, was gone. He was emotional, trying to process his own injuries and her death, but he tried his best to help Gunter. He told him that, realistically, he couldn't remember what happened. He remembered hearing the doors open, turning around, seeing 2 figures. But after he was shot, it was like his memory of the event was just wiped clean. He had almost nothing to offer the investigation. And just like that, Gunter was back to square one. For the next 2 years, Gunter and his task force worked tirelessly to try to catch the woman without a face. They spent millions of euros. They clocked thousands upon thousands of hours of overtime. They even offered a massive reward equivalent to 400,000 American dollars for any information that could lead to her capture. But none of it led anywhere. And adding insult to injury was the fact that while this massive investigation was going on, the woman without a face just kept committing crimes. The task force connected her DNA to at least 6 more break-ins, 1 more robbery, and another murder. And her crimes weren't just happening in Germany anymore. They also found the woman's DNA at crime scenes in France and in Austria. The entire region was now on high alert for this woman who seemed to be an impossibly cunning international criminal genius. And Gunter, after all this time and all this effort, couldn't help but start to wonder if he would ever be able to catch her. But then, in March of 2009, Gunter got a call from a police officer in France. And what this officer told him would change everything. The officer explained that the French police were currently investigating a potential murder. A badly burned body had been found, so disfigured that for a while all police knew was that the victim was a man. However, an asylum seeker who had recently come to France had been reported missing, and the police wondered if maybe the body belonged to him. So, on a hunch, they had gotten his asylum application paperwork. That paperwork included his official fingerprints. The investigators had been able to lift a DNA profile from the ink on those prints, but when they got the DNA analyzed, the results made absolutely no sense. The French police were so baffled by what they found that they knew they had to call Gunter. They knew that if anyone in Europe needed to know about this bizarre DNA result, it was him. Gunter listened as the officer filled him in on the baffling results they had found. At first, he was just as confused as they were. But at the same time, he felt a new surge of hope. To him, it felt like, as bizarre as this new information was, maybe this was the break he had been looking for the past 2 years. Maybe this was the clue that would finally allow him to figure out who this woman really was. He thanked the French police officer for the call and immediately brought this new information to his team. Within just a few days, this new information from France did in fact lead Gunter and his team directly to the woman with no face. It would turn out that this woman, the international criminal mastermind behind dozens of crimes, including at least 4 murders, who had evaded capture for 16 years all across Germany and beyond, appeared to everyone who actually knew her as a completely normal person. No one would have ever suspected she was responsible for all these horrible crimes. She was a young woman who lived in southern Germany. During the day, she worked at a factory. At night, she just went home. She lived a very ordinary, unremarkable life. And so, again, nobody ever suspected her. But what the French police found when they analyzed the DNA from the missing man's asylum application was that the man's fingerprints on the paper somehow contained this woman's DNA. This was clearly impossible. The man was biologically male, and the woman without a face was biologically female. They knew that for a fact. So even if the asylum seeker had secretly been this woman in disguise, that wasn't physically possible. And when the French police saw this impossible result, they knew they had to tell Gunter. When Gunter and his team looked into this, they finally figured out the shocking truth. It was precisely this woman's normal-seeming life, and in particular her very normal-seeming job at the factory, that made everything possible. Because at this factory, this woman sat on an assembly line helping to manufacture the very cotton swabs that police all over Europe used for DNA testing. On any given shift, this woman would touch hundreds, maybe even thousands of these swabs with her bare hands. And in doing so, she would accidentally leave microscopic traces of her own DNA behind on each one. There was no international serial killer. There was no brilliant female criminal mastermind parading around the country. There was just a massive, years-long contamination issue Police had been using cotton swabs that were already contaminated with this factory worker's DNA. And so, in essence, the police had wasted nearly 2 decades of work, millions and millions of euros, and thousands of hours of overtime chasing a criminal who didn't even exist. It was later determined that the police officer, Martin Arnold, and his partner Michelle were not attacked by some phantom killer. They were shot by 2 members of a neo-Nazi group. However, many of the other murders and serious crimes that had been attributed to the woman without a face over the years are still unsolved to this day, primarily because the police spent so long chasing the wrong suspect. Today, the case of the woman without a face is considered one of the biggest and most profound embarrassments in German police history. On the afternoon of the 2nd of May 1930, a middle-aged woman named Kim Soo-jin walked into her small farmhouse. She was in a village called Bongmyeon in what is now South Korea. She had spent the entire day working outside on her farm under the hot sun. All she wanted to do was get some water, sit down, and finally just rest for a moment. But before she could even do that, she heard a knock at her door. And even though she was exhausted, the sound of that knock actually energized her. She was almost certain that her 16-year-old son, Bak Chang-soo, had finally come home. Soo-jin and her son ran the farm together, just the 2 of them. They barely made any money doing it. In fact, a lot of the time, they didn't even grow enough food to feed themselves. So, to try to make ends meet, Soo-jin's son had recently started a full-time job at an inn in town. He also frequently picked up odd jobs around the village for extra cash. The problem was, Chang-soo would sometimes go straight from his job at the inn to one of those odd jobs, and he didn't always have time to stop by the farmhouse to tell his mother where he was going first. And this was 1,930 inches rural Korea. It wasn't like he could just call her on the phone. And so, this meant his mother was left to worry about him pretty frequently. And for the past 6 days, that is all Soo-jin had been doing. She had not seen or heard from her son at all. And even though he had gone for a few days at a time in the past, working these different odd jobs, a full week was a pretty long time for him to be gone without any word. But she kept telling herself what must have happened. He must have found some good work with a family who was having him live with them full time. It was probably a great opportunity, and he had taken it. Surely he would be home soon. And now, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, he was. So Soo-jin rushed to the front door. She pulled it open, but the hopeful smile on her face faded immediately. It was not her son standing on the doorstep. Instead, it was 2 police officers. The first thing they asked her was if she knew of any teenage boys who were missing from the village. Soo-jin told them that she had a son of her own who was a teenager. He was 16. And the reality was, she didn't know exactly where he was, and he had been gone for the past week. But she quickly added, "Don't worry, he isn't missing. He is very likely just working for a family somewhere, and he will be home soon." But after she said this, the police officers looked at Soo-jin with clear pity on their faces. They told her they were so sorry, but they were nearly certain that her son had been murdered. Soo-jin just stared at them in shock and disbelief. They explained to her that a few days ago, during the time her son was gone, a teenage boy's body had been found on a nearby mountain. An autopsy had been performed, and it showed he had been beaten and then strangled to death. For the last couple of days, the police had been traveling all over the village, interviewing people, trying to figure out who this poor boy was. And based on everything they had learned so far, Soo-jin's son, Chang-soo, was the only teenager in the entire area who wasn't accounted for. Hearing all of this, Soo-jin simply could not believe it was true. Her son was a good boy. He stayed out of trouble and worked incredibly hard. She couldn't imagine why anyone in the world would want to hurt him. So, she just told the police this has to be a mistake, but the police didn't seem to think so. They just said that they needed her to come with them to the local hospital morgue to identify the body. A little while later, Soo-jin arrived at the hospital with the 2 police officers. As they led her through the entrance, down a few long hallways, and towards the morgue, she kept telling herself over and over that her son was okay. He was still alive, and this was all just some kind of horrible, horrible mistake. It had to be. But the second she walked into the cold room of the morgue and saw the body lying on the metal table, her eyes welled up with tears. Because she knew, instantly, that it was her son. To Soo-jin, this moment felt like she had left real life and stepped into a nightmare. Her son's face and body were covered in bruises and wounds. He was clearly decomposing. It was an awful, traumatic thing for a mother to see. But as she stood there staring down at a parent's worst nightmare, she noticed something strange. She turned to the police officers and told them that this was her son, definitely. But the clothes he was wearing were not his. And for some reason, to Soo-jin, this detail about the clothes felt very, very important. She started rattling off ideas for where they could have come from. It was like her brain had suddenly fixated on this one strange detail to avoid the overwhelming trauma of losing her son. She started telling the police that maybe the family he was working for let him borrow them. Or maybe he bought them without her knowing. Or maybe, she said, whoever killed him dressed him up in these clothes for some reason. But when she said that last part out loud, it was like the reality of her son being dead just came crashing down on her all at once. She started shaking uncontrollably, and before she knew it, she had collapsed onto the floor and was sobbing hysterically. Less than a week later, Soo-jin was sitting in her quiet farmhouse, staring out her front window in a daze, when she saw the police walking up the path towards her house again. Over the past few days, she hadn't heard any updates about her son's case. She had just been at the farmhouse, all alone, trying to make sense of his violent death. But now, seeing the officers, she went right outside to meet them. She asked them, "Do you have news for me about what happened to my son?" And they told her that she would likely want to sit down to hear this. Soo-jin figured it couldn't possibly be worse than finding out your son has been murdered. So she said, "Okay, let's go inside." They all went inside the farmhouse and sat down. And then the police told her that they had figured out who had killed her son. They told her they had not one, but two people in jail right now who had both given full confessions. Both of these suspects were people that Soo-jin's son, Chong-soo, had worked with Wei at the inn in town. One of them was a young man, and one was a young woman. Apparently, Chong-soo had gotten involved in the woman's personal life. She was having an affair with a married man, but was secretly planning to run away with a different man from the village. And Chong-soo had told the married man about her plan. When the woman found out that Chong-soo had exposed her secret, she was furious. So furious, in fact, that she conspired with her male coworker, the other suspect, to get revenge. They lured Chong-soo out to the mountains under the guise of gathering wild vegetables. And then, when they got him out there, the man and the woman beat Chong-soo and then strangled him to death. This had all happened on the very first night that Chong-soo had left the farmhouse. So, over that 6-day period when his mother was worried, he was never living with another family and working for them. He was dead on the mountain the whole time. The police told Soo-jin that they had charged both suspects with murder. But after hearing all of this, Soo-jin still had one question. "What about my son's clothes?" she asked. Was there anything in the suspects' confessions about that? But the police just shook their heads no. They said the clothes didn't really seem relevant to the case anyway. And this time, even though Soo-jin still felt deep down that the clothes had to mean something, she didn't argue. She didn't try to come up with other theories. She just sort of accepted what the police had told her. As horrible as it was to know that her son was murdered over something so petty, she was at least glad to know that his killers were behind bars. Soo-jin eventually got her son's body from the police, and she was able to give him a proper burial in the local cemetery. And then, after that, she did her best to try to move on. But she never could. Every single night, she had the same terrible nightmare, replaying the moment she saw her son's body in the morgue. And as this nightmare kept happening, night after night, Soo-jin slowly became convinced that her son was haunting her dreams. She basically stopped sleeping. She couldn't really eat. She certainly couldn't work. Her farm fell into disrepair. She honestly began to think she was just going to wither away and die there unless something changed. She was overcome with grief and sadness, and she was also just plain scared. These dreams were terrifying. But then, on the night of the 18th of October, 1931, about 6 months after her son was killed, Sujin woke up from yet another nightmare. And when she opened her eyes, she saw a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed. She immediately realized that it was her son's ghost coming to visit her. But Sujin, she wasn't scared this time. She actually felt tears welling up in her eyes. And she just began speaking to the figure. She told the ghost, "I love you, but you have to move on. You have to rest in peace now. You have to." Sujin really didn't know what she expected to happen when she began speaking to the ghost. But what did happen was definitely not something she would have ever considered. Because suddenly, the ghost opened its mouth. And it spoke, and what the ghost said changed everything. It would turn out that Chong-su, Sujin's son, had been viciously attacked by that man and woman up on the mountain. They really had beaten and strangled him and left him for dead. But he didn't die. He had survived the attack. And when he came to, he fled the area. He was terrified that if he went back home, they would find him and finish the job. So, he didn't have a chance to tell his mom that he was essentially on the run. And for 6 months, he lived in random towns doing odd jobs just to survive. But eventually, after 6 months, he missed his mom. He missed his home. So he went back. And he walked into her room in the middle of the night. He was the ghost she saw at the foot of her bed. And when she said to him, "You need to rest in peace now," he just said to his mom, "I'm not dead." He was just being honest. He was there. He was back. He had survived. It would turn out the body that was found on the mountain was just some other teenage boy who, by the way, was never identified. He just happened to be in the same area where Chong-su had been attacked. And so when word got out about this body being found on the mountain, the man and the woman who had attacked Chong-su immediately thought, "That's him. That was us." And so they confessed to killing him because that is what they had tried to do. They just didn't succeed. It was some other boy's body. And when Sujin went to the morgue and saw this body, it was decomposing and badly bruised, and in her grief, it looked like her son. And so she misidentified him. She thought it was her son, but it really wasn't. Her intuition had fixated on his clothes, and she knew something was off. Well, she was right. It wasn't her son, and those were someone else's clothes. In the end, the man and woman who had attacked Chong-su had their murder charges dropped because they didn't actually commit a murder. They were both ultimately released from jail after serving about a year in prison for the assault. As for the actual person who was found dead on the mountain, that poor boy was never identified. He was buried in an unmarked grave, and over the years, the location of that grave has been lost to time. And so, even though we have the ability today to test for DNA, we are not able to exhume his body because we don't know where he is. And so, it is very likely we will never know who that person was. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In October of 2014, a 35-year-old woman, who we will call Olivia, was going about her normal day in Western New York. It was a crisp, cool autumn day, the kind of day where the leaves are turning vibrant shades of orange and red, and there is a slight chill in the air. Olivia had planned a simple, quiet day, but she was looking forward to one specific event. She was going to meet her husband for lunch at a local restaurant. They had not seen much of each other during the busy work week, so they wanted to sit down, catch up, and enjoy a nice meal together. When they arrived at the restaurant, they were greeted by the warm aroma of fresh food, and they were seated at a comfortable table in the corner. Originally, they had not planned to stay at this restaurant for very long. They figured they would grab a quick bite, chat for maybe 45 minutes, and then get back to their respective schedules. But as they started talking, they realized how much they had missed each other's company. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and they found themselves laughing and sharing stories about their week. One thing led to another, and before they knew it, the hours were just flying by. They ordered some appetizers, which included a large basket of warm, freshly baked bread. They ate the bread with butter, enjoying every bite. Then they ordered their main courses, which consisted of large plates of pasta covered in rich, heavy sauces. They talked through the entire meal, and when they finished, they decided they were having such a good time that they did not want it to end just yet. So they ordered some cakes and other desserts, along with some coffee. By the time they finally looked at their watches, they were absolutely shocked to see that it was 6 in the evening. They had been sitting at that restaurant for 6 hours. Over those 6 hours, both Olivia and her husband had consumed a massive amount of food. They had eaten multiple baskets of bread, heavy pasta dishes, and sweet cakes. Along with all of this food, they had also ordered some alcoholic drinks. However, because both of them knew they had to drive home afterward, they were extremely careful about how much they drank. Olivia made sure to pace herself very strictly. Over the entire 6-hour period, she only had 4 alcoholic drinks. Since she had spread those 4 drinks out over such a long time, she knew she would be completely sober and safe to drive. Her husband was equally cautious, limiting his own drinking to make sure he was well under the legal limit. After they got the check and paid for their large meal, they walked out to the parking lot. The sun had already gone down, and it was dark outside. They said their goodbyes, gave each other a hug, and hopped into their respective cars to begin the drive home. As Olivia was driving down the dark roads of Western New York, navigating the familiar turns, she suddenly heard a loud, jarring pop from the front of her car. The steering wheel violently jerked in her hands, and the vehicle began to pull heavily to the right. She immediately realized that she had gotten a flat tire. Olivia kept her cool, slowly steering her car off to the side of the road, and pulled over onto the shoulder. She put the car in park, turned on her hazard lights, and pulled her phone out of her purse. She called roadside assistance to report the flat tire and asked for a tow truck or a mechanic to come out and help her change it. As she was waiting inside her warm car, she decided to step outside for a moment to look at the damage. The air was cold, and she stood near the front passenger side tire, which was completely flat and resting on the rim. At this exact moment, another motorist happened to drive past her on the dark road. This driver saw Olivia standing outside her car with a severely deflated tire. In the darkness, the driver completely misunderstood the situation. They did not see a woman waiting for roadside assistance. They thought she had just been in a major car accident and might be in shock or injured. Concerned for her safety, the passing motorist decided to call the police and report that a woman had been in an accident on the side of the road. A few minutes later, a police car pulled up behind Olivia's vehicle. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the dark road. 2 police officers got out of their cruiser and walked up to Olivia. They asked her if she was okay and if she had been involved in an accident. Olivia smiled, trying to reassure them, and said that she was totally fine. She explained that she had simply gotten a flat tire and was just waiting for roadside assistance to arrive. She thanked them for stopping to check on her. But as the officers stood there listening to her speak, they began to notice some classic signs of intoxication. They saw that her eyes looked glassy and glazed over, which is a common indicator of alcohol consumption. Furthermore, as she was speaking to them, they could have sworn she was slurring her words and speaking a bit slower than normal. This made the officers highly suspicious. They looked at her and asked if she had been drinking tonight. Olivia, wanting to be honest, told them that yes, she had had a few drinks, but she quickly explained that she had only consumed 4 drinks over the course of a 6-hour lunch, and she insisted that she did not feel drunk at all. She told them her flat tire had nothing to do with her drinking, and she was completely sober. The police officers, however, were not buying her story. Her physical appearance and the way she was speaking did not match her claim of being sober. They decided to put her through a series of field sobriety tests. They had her step away from her car and perform several physical tasks. They had her walk in a straight line, placing her heel to her toe, turn around, and walk back. They had her stand on one leg while counting out loud. They also did the eye test, where she had to follow a pen with her eyes without moving her head. Olivia managed to complete the tests, but she struggled with them just enough to send up some major red flags for the officers. At this point, they were convinced she was impaired, so they pulled out a breathalyzer device and asked her to blow into it. A breathalyzer is a small handheld tool that measures the amount of alcohol in a person's system by analyzing their breath, giving a reading of their blood alcohol content, or BAC. In the United States, the legal limit for operating a motor vehicle is 0.08%. To give you an idea of what that means, if a typical 160-pound woman were to drink about 3 or 4 alcoholic beverages in a single hour, her BAC would likely rise to right around that 0.08 limit. If that same woman were to consume 8 drinks in an hour, her BAC would spike to 0.20%. At that level, she would be incredibly drunk, unable to function, and would likely be suffering from alcohol poisoning, eventually losing consciousness. And if she were to drink 13 alcoholic drinks in an hour, her BAC would jump all the way up to a lethal 0.40%, which is a level where a person is at risk of dying from alcohol toxicity. Olivia was completely confident when she took the breathalyzer. She knew she had only had 4 drinks over 6 hours, which meant her body should have easily processed the alcohol, leaving her well below the legal limit of 0.08%. She blew into the tube and waited for the device to register her level. When the numbers appeared on the screen, the police officers stared at it in complete shock. They looked at each other, then back at the screen, and then at Olivia. The device read a staggering 0.33%. This was an impossibly high number. At a 0.33% BAC, a normal human being should be slipping into unconsciousness or actively dying. Yet here was Olivia, standing on the side of the road, speaking to them, and appearing only slightly buzzed. The officers immediately assumed that their breathalyzer machine must be broken or malfunctioning. It was the only logical explanation. So they walked back to their patrol car, grabbed a completely different breathalyzer device, and brought it over. They had Olivia blow into the second machine, but when the second reading popped up, the result was exactly the same. She blew a 0.33% BAC once again. The officers were completely mystified by how this woman could have such an extreme, superhuman tolerance to alcohol. But regardless of their confusion, they had to follow the law. They charged her with driving while intoxicated, placed her under arrest, and decided to transport her straight to the local hospital so medical professionals could intervene and monitor her safety, given how dangerously high her alcohol levels were. When she arrived at the hospital, doctors immediately admitted her and began running blood tests. But as the hours rolled by, the mystery only grew deeper. A full 24 hours passed, during which Olivia was kept in a hospital room with absolutely no access to alcohol. Yet, when doctors tested her blood again, her blood alcohol content was still incredibly high. It made absolutely no sense. How could someone who had not consumed a single drop of alcohol in 24 hours still have a massive amount of alcohol in their system? The doctors were completely baffled, and they began running a series of specialized medical tests to figure out what was happening inside her body. It was during this extensive medical investigation that they made a shocking discovery. It turned out that Olivia had an incredibly rare and bizarre medical condition known as auto-brewery syndrome. In simple terms, this condition meant that her digestive system had a unique imbalance of yeast and fungi that literally acted like a brewery. When Olivia consumed carbohydrates or glucose, such as the bread, pasta, and cakes she had eaten during her 6-hour lunch, her digestive system would ferment those sugars and turn them directly into pure alcohol inside her body. Olivia had been completely unaware of this condition her entire life. She had developed an incredibly high tolerance to alcohol over the years because her body was essentially brewing its own alcohol all the time, making her constantly drunk without her even realizing it. She was not a heavy drinker, but because she ate normal carbohydrates like bread and pasta, her body was constantly producing its own supply of alcohol. The doctors explained that if this condition is left untreated, it can cause the exact same severe organ damage, liver failure, and cognitive issues as chronic heavy alcoholism. The only way to treat auto-brewery syndrome is to make a drastic, permanent change in diet. Once Olivia's medical diagnosis was officially confirmed and made public to the court, the prosecutors realized she had no idea she was impaired and had not willingly consumed that much alcohol, so they dropped all the charges against her. Olivia was incredibly relieved, and she immediately made the decision to completely eliminate carbohydrates from her diet, resolving to never eat bread or pasta again to keep her body from brewing alcohol. Now, let us move on to our second story, which takes us back in time to the year 1887. In Paris, France, there was a 35-year-old man named Robert Ladru. Robert was an exceptionally talented detective working for the Parisian police force. He had a brilliant mind for details, an incredible ability to read people, and a logical approach to solving crimes that made him famous throughout the country. He was so skilled that whenever police departments in other towns and cities across France encountered a case that they simply could not solve, they would write letters to the headquarters in Paris and beg for Robert to be sent to help them. He was essentially the ultimate detective, a man who could see the tiny details that everyone else missed. In the spring of 1887, a peaceful, small coastal town in northern France was facing a terrifying mystery. Over the course of several months, a number of local sailors had suddenly gone missing. They would go out for walks or head down to the docks at night, and they would never return. No bodies were found, no signs of struggles were discovered, and the local police force had absolutely no leads or suspects. The townspeople were growing increasingly panicked, and the local authorities were completely out of their depth. So, they reached out to Paris and requested the assistance of Robert Ladru. Robert accepted the assignment and began the long journey from Paris to the northern coast. Traveling in those days was slow and tiring, and by the time Robert finally arrived in the small coastal town, it was extremely late at night. The streets were pitch black, and the cool ocean breeze was blowing through the empty town. Robert was completely exhausted from his travels, so he decided that he would not begin his investigation that night. Instead, he went straight to a local hotel, checked into his room, and went to bed, falling into a deep and heavy sleep. The next morning, Robert woke up feeling refreshed and ready to work. He got dressed, gathered his notebook, and walked down to the local police station to meet with the chief of police and the other officers he would be working with on the missing sailors case. But when he walked into the station, he noticed that the atmosphere was chaotic and tense. The officers were running around, talking in hushed, panicked voices, and there was a sense of urgency in the air. Robert walked up to the chief of police, who looked incredibly tired and stressed. The chief apologized to Robert and delivered some shocking news. He explained that the case of the missing sailors had suddenly been lowered in priority. The reason was that during the night, a brutal murder had been committed right on the town's local beach. This was the first murder the quiet town had seen in years, and the entire police force had to be mobilized to investigate it immediately. The chief told Robert that he was deeply sorry for bringing him all the way from Paris for the missing sailors case only to change plans, but then he asked Robert if he would be willing to help them investigate this fresh beach murder instead. Robert, being a dedicated lawman, did not hesitate. He told the chief that he would be honored to assist them in any way he could. The chief began to share the details of the crime. The victim was a middle-aged man named Audrey Mestre. Audrey was a well-respected man who owned a successful and popular dress shop in Paris. He had recently decided to retire or take a break from the busy city life, so he had bought a home in this quiet coastal town to relax and enjoy the beautiful ocean views. But early that morning, a local resident walking along the beach had spotted a body lying in the sand. It was Audrey. The police had rushed to the scene and conducted an initial examination of the body. They determined that Audrey had been killed by a single gunshot wound to the chest. The bullet had traveled with intense force, passing clean through his body and exiting out his back. But the problem was, the police had not been able to find the bullet anywhere in the surrounding sand. They had no suspects, no leads, and no obvious motive. The officers were able to rule out robbery almost immediately because when they searched Audrey's clothing, they found that his wallet, his money, and all of his expensive jewelry were still completely intact on his person. Whoever had killed Audrey had not done it for money. Robert, the chief of police, and several local officers left the station and walked down to the beach to examine the crime scene. The beach was a wide stretch of soft sand, bordered by a steep stone wall and a set of wooden stairs that led up to the main coastal road. The local officers immediately went to work near the spot where Audrey's body had been found, dropping to their knees to sift through the sand, desperately searching for the missing bullet that had passed through the victim. Robert, however, decided to take a different path. He knew that the immediate area around a body is often contaminated by first responders, so he walked a short distance down the beach, keeping his eyes glued to the ground, looking for any subtle clues that others might have overlooked. After walking just a little ways away from the main scene, Robert stopped in his tracks. In the soft, damp sand, he noticed a set of footprints. They were barely visible, but they were definitely there. As Robert followed the footprints with his eyes, he saw that they came from the direction of the town, passed directly by the spot where Audrey's body had been found, and then continued past the crime scene toward the wooden stairs. The prints went up the stairs and then disappeared completely once they hit the hard pavement of the road. Robert called the other officers over and showed them the footprints. He instructed them to immediately make plaster casts of the prints so they could preserve the evidence and analyze them. Making a plaster cast is a standard forensic technique. The officers would mix liquid plaster in a bucket, carefully pour it into the impressions in the sand, and then wait for it to dry and harden. Once dry, they would pull the hardened plaster out, and it would give them a perfect three-dimensional replica of the exact shape and size of the shoe or foot that had made the print. While the officers were busy preparing the plaster, Robert stood over the prints, staring at them with a look of deep concentration. One of the officers noticed his expression and asked him what he was thinking. Robert replied that the footprints looked incredibly odd to him. He said they felt strangely familiar, as if he had seen them somewhere before, but he simply could not place where or when he had seen them. Less than an hour later, the plaster had dried completely. The officers carefully pried the casts out of the sand, brushed away the loose dirt, and handed them to Robert. The moment Robert's hands touched the plaster casts and he looked down at the shapes, his body physically reacted. He gasped, his face was completely pale, and a look of absolute horror and disappointment washed over him. He did not say a single word to the officers standing around him. He simply turned around, holding the plaster casts tightly against his chest, and walked away. He walked down the beach to a highly secluded, rocky area where no one could see him. He sat down on a cold rock and placed the plaster casts in front of him. And then he just sat there. He sat there for hours and hours, completely motionless, staring intently at the white plaster shapes. The hours ticked by, and the hot afternoon sun blazed down on him, but he did not seem to feel the heat. The tide began to turn, and the ocean water started to rapidly creep up the beach, splashing against the rocks near his feet, but he did not move a muscle. He was completely lost in his own mind, staring at the plaster. The local officers watched him from a distance, utterly mystified by his behavior. They did not know what to make of this legendary Parisian detective sitting alone on the rocks for hours. But because of his massive reputation as a genius, they did not dare to interrupt him or ask him what he was doing. They simply assumed he was engaging in some highly advanced detective method that was far beyond their understanding. Finally, as the afternoon was beginning to fade, Robert stood up. He picked up the plaster casts, walked back over to the waiting officers, and looked them in the eyes. He told them that there was no reason to stay at the beach any longer, and there was no need to interview any more witnesses because he believed he had solved the case. But, once again, instead of elaborating or explaining his theory, he simply turned around, walked up the wooden stairs, and headed back to his hotel. The local officers looked at each other, completely baffled, and shrugged their shoulders. Having nothing left to do, they packed up their equipment and returned to the station. Early the next morning, one of the officers searching the beach finally found the bullet that had killed Audrey Mestre. It was buried deep in the sand near the crime scene. When Robert arrived at the beach later that morning to meet with the police, the chief of police walked up to him with a look of excitement and handed him the bullet, believing this would be the final piece of evidence Robert needed to arrest the killer. Robert took the small metal bullet, looked at it closely, and let out a deep, heavy sigh. He looked at the chief of police with tears in his eyes and said that now he knew for sure what had happened. He then proceeded to describe the murder in vivid, precise detail. Robert told the officers that on the night of the crime, the killer had woken up in the middle of the night in his hotel room. The killer had gotten out of bed, put on his clothes, and walked out into the dark night, heading straight down to the beach. While walking along the shore, the killer encountered Audrey Mestre, who was also out for a late-night walk. The two men had a friendly conversation at first, but at some point, a sudden and intense argument broke out between them. In a moment of anger, the killer pulled out his revolver, shot Audrey directly in the chest, and then quickly fled the scene, walking back up the stairs to his room. The chief of police was amazed by this detailed reconstruction and asked Robert how he could possibly know all of this. Robert looked at him and said that he knew because he was the killer. He had killed Audrey Mestre. But he explained that he did not do it on purpose, and he had absolutely no memory of doing it because he had been sleepwalking. Robert explained that when he looked at the plaster casts of the footprints on the beach, he realized why they looked so familiar. The cast showed that whoever had made those prints was missing a toe. And, as it happened, Robert himself was missing a toe. The footprints in the sand matched his own feet perfectly. Furthermore, when he had woken up in his hotel room that morning, before he even knew a murder had occurred, he had noticed that his shoes and socks next to his bed were damp and covered in wet sand. He had thought it was strange at the time, but he was in a hurry to get to the police station, so he had ignored it. After spending hours staring at the casts on the beach, he had gone back to his hotel room and checked his personal revolver, which he kept hidden under his pillow. He always kept the gun fully loaded, but when he checked it, he was horrified to find that one bullet was missing. He spent the entire night trying to convince himself that it was all just a terrible coincidence, but when the chief of police handed him the bullet found on the beach, all doubt was erased. The bullet was the exact rare type of ammunition that Robert used in his personal gun. He had caught himself. The police were absolutely stunned. They could not believe that their star detective, a man of such high standing, was responsible for this terrible crime. They wondered if Robert was having a mental breakdown or if this was some incredibly elaborate cover-up. To test whether he was actually telling the truth about his sleepwalking, they decided to conduct a scientific experiment. Robert agreed to cooperate fully. The police placed him inside a secure jail cell where he would be monitored 24 hours a day by armed guards. They placed his personal revolver under his pillow, but they loaded it with blank rounds instead of live ammunition. They told him to go to sleep as he normally would. For the first few nights, nothing happened. Robert slept peacefully, and he never reached for the gun. But about a week into the experiment, in the dead of night, the guards watching the cell saw Robert suddenly sit up. He was in a deep trance-like state, his eyes wide open but completely vacant, staring into nothingness. He slowly reached his hand under his pillow, pulled out the revolver, aimed it directly at the guards standing outside his cell, and began firing the blank rounds. This terrifying demonstration completely convinced the police and the medical experts that Robert was telling the absolute truth. He had indeed killed Audrey Mestre while completely unconscious in a state of sleepwalking. Because he lacked any criminal intent or conscious awareness of his actions, the authorities decided that it would not be right to prosecute him for murder. However, they also recognized that he was incredibly dangerous to the public when he fell asleep. To protect everyone, they made the difficult decision to exile Robert. For the rest of his life, until he passed away in 1937, Robert Ladru was forced to live in complete isolation on a secluded farm far outside of Paris. The only people he ever saw were medical doctors who would visit him to study his condition. But even then, the doctors would only visit during the bright daylight hours, and they always made sure to bring armed bodyguards with them, just in case Robert were to fall asleep. Now, let us move on to our third and final story, which begins on the 18th of December, 1956, with the premiere of a brand new television game show called To Tell the Truth. This show was broadcast on a major American television network and quickly became a massive sensation across the country. The premise of the game show was incredibly simple yet highly entertaining. In each episode, a panel of 4 celebrity judges would be introduced to 3 different contestants. All 3 of these contestants would claim to be the exact same person. This person was always someone remarkable, someone who had achieved something extraordinary, possessed an incredible talent, or lived a highly unusual and fascinating life. While all 3 contestants claimed to be this remarkable person, only one of them was telling the truth. The other 2 contestants were imposters who had been thoroughly briefed on the real person's life, and their job was to lie as convincingly as possible to trick the celebrity judges. During the show, the host would read a brief biography of the real, remarkable person. After the biography was read, the celebrity judges would have a set amount of time to ask all 3 contestants various questions about their background, their career, their achievements, and their personal lives. The judges would listen closely to their answers, trying to spot any lies, hesitation, or inconsistencies. Once the questioning period was over, each of the 4 celebrity judges would cast a vote for the contestant they believed was telling the truth. After the votes were tallied, the host of the show would look at the contestants and say the famous line, "Will the real person please stand up?" The true individual would then stand up, the audience would erupt in thunderous applause, and the imposters would smile and congratulate them. The show was incredibly popular, and it ran for decades, producing thousands of episodes that were watched by millions of Americans. For the most part, the episodes were very lighthearted, fun, and predictable. But there was one specific episode that would go down in television history as the absolute most unique, bizarre, and chilling episode ever recorded. Fast forward to October of 1972. On this particular evening, 3 clean-cut, polite men walked out onto the stage and took their places in front of the 4 celebrity judges. All 3 of them wore nice suits, smiled warmly at the audience, and introduced themselves as Ed Edwards. The host of the show then stepped up to his podium and began reading the biography of the real Ed Edwards. The biography was fascinating. The host explained that at one point in his life, Ed Edwards had been a highly dangerous criminal. In fact, he had been so prolific and dangerous that he had earned a spot on the FBI's list of the top 10 most wanted fugitives in America. He had committed multiple armed robberies, impersonated federal officers, and broken out of jail. But then, while serving a long prison sentence, a compassionate prison guard had taken an interest in him and helped him turn his life around. Upon his release from prison 14 years later, Ed had supposedly become a completely reformed man. He had written a successful autobiography, and he had become a popular motivational speaker. He traveled around the country talking to youth groups, civic organizations, and business leaders, teaching people how to identify con men, how to spot criminals, and how to protect themselves from being victims of crime. After this impressive biography was read, the three contestants sat down and the celebrity judges began asking them questions. The judges asked about his time on the run, his experiences in prison, the process of writing his book, and how he had managed to change his life. All three men answered the questions with confidence, charm, and poise. When the time was up, the celebrity judges cast their votes. Two of the four judges correctly guessed which man was the real Ed Edwards. When the host finally asked the real Ed Edwards to stand up, a man in a neat suit and glasses stood up, smiling warmly. The audience clapped loudly, completely charmed by him. He did not look like an ex-convict or a dangerous fugitive. He looked like an ordinary, friendly, all-American father who lived next door, someone who loved his family and wouldn't hurt a fly. He seemed completely harmless, and the episode ended on a highly positive, inspiring note. After the episode aired, the public eventually forgot about Ed Edwards, and he faded back into ordinary life. But decades later, in 2009, a dark and terrifying truth would finally begin to emerge. Ed Edwards had a daughter named April Blasio. In 2009, April was a 40-year-old woman, but she had spent her entire childhood and adult life plagued by deep suspicion and fear regarding her father. Despite her father's public claims that he was a completely reformed man, a loving father, and a law-abiding citizen, April never believed it. Behind the closed doors of their family home, Ed Edwards was not a warm, charming, motivational speaker. He was an incredibly violent, abusive man with a terrifying temper. He was also a compulsive liar who manipulated everyone around him. During the 1970s and 1980s, when April was just a young girl, her father would suddenly force the entire family to pack up all of their belongings and move to a new town. These moves did not happen with planning or preparation. Often, in the middle of the night, Ed would wake the children up, tell them to grab what they could, throw everything into the car, and drive away to a completely different state. April was always deeply unsettled by this. She assumed that her dad was constantly running from the law or involved in some sort of serious criminal activity. Whenever she or her mother would ask Ed why they had to keep moving so suddenly, Ed always had a quick, convincing explanation. He would tell them that when he was in prison, he had acted as an informant and had snitched on some highly dangerous people. He claimed that those dangerous criminals had finally tracked down where they were living, and so the family had to flee immediately to protect their lives. April knew deep down that her father was lying to her, but as a child, there was nothing she could do. They kept moving from town to town, state to state, never staying in one place for very long. But she could never shake the feeling that her father was hiding a much darker, more sinister secret. Fast forward to 2009. April was now 40 years old, and she was laying in her bed late one night, unable to sleep. Her mind began to wander back to her childhood and the strange, chaotic life her father had forced them to live. She decided that she was finally going to do some investigating of her own. She got out of bed, opened her laptop, and opened a search engine. She decided to start typing in the names of the various small towns where her family had briefly lived during her childhood. She decided she would type the name of a town, followed by phrases like unsolved murder or unsolved mystery, to see if anything had happened in those towns during the exact brief windows of time that her family had lived there. As she began her search, she went through several towns with no results. But then she typed in the name of a town called Watertown, Wisconsin. Her family had lived there for a very brief period in 1980. When she pressed search, an article popped up that made her stomach drop. The article described an unsolved double homicide that had occurred in Watertown in August of 1980. A young teenage couple had been attending a wedding reception. At some point during the evening, they decided to leave the reception and drive down a quiet, dead-end road to spend some time alone together in their car. While they were sitting in the car, an unknown man had suddenly walked out of the darkness, approached the vehicle, broke inside, and shot both teenagers to death before disappearing into the night. The police had a vague description of the suspect, but they had never been able to solve the case. As April read the details of the crime, she realized that the murder had occurred during the exact small window of time that her family had been living in Watertown. Furthermore, the physical description of the suspect matched her father, Ed Edwards, perfectly. Acting on a strong gut instinct, April called the Watertown Police Department the very next day. She spoke to a detective and explained that she believed her father might be responsible for the 1,980 double murder. She explained that they had lived in the area at the time and that her father fit the physical description of the killer perfectly. She also shared her father's criminal history and his violent nature. The detectives were intrigued by her call. They decided to look into Ed Edwards, who was currently living in Kentucky as an elderly man. They tracked him down and managed to obtain a sample of his DNA. They sent the sample to a laboratory to be compared with the DNA evidence that had been recovered from the crime scene back in 1980. A short time later, the results came back. The DNA was a perfect match. Ed Edwards was indeed the killer. In 2009, police officers arrested Ed Edwards at his home in Kentucky and extradited him to Wisconsin to face charges for the double murder. As soon as Ed was placed in custody and realized that the police had his DNA, his entire demeanor changed. He did not deny the crimes. Instead, he immediately confessed to the murders of the young couple. But then, Ed did something very strange. He asked the prosecutors if he could receive the death penalty for his crimes. He was an elderly, sick man, and he seemed to want the state to execute him. However, the prosecutors explained to him that under Wisconsin law, the maximum punishment for his crimes was life in prison without the possibility of parole. Wisconsin did not have the death penalty. Ed was incredibly frustrated by this news. He did not want to spend the rest of his life rotting in a prison cell. So he decided to use his knowledge of other crimes as a bargaining chip. He reached out to detectives and confessed to another double homicide that he had committed back in 1,977 Inches, Ohio. In that case, he had targeted and murdered another young teenage couple. Ed believed that by confessing to these murders in Ohio, he would be eligible for the death penalty. But through a legal loophole and the specific laws of that state at the time, the prosecutors told him that he was still only facing life in prison. Even more frustrated, Ed decided to play his final card. He revealed a third, highly chilling murder that he had committed in 1996. He confessed that he had murdered his own foster son, a young man named Danny Boy Edwards. Ed had taken the young man in, raised him, and then killed him in cold blood in order to collect a massive double indemnity life insurance policy. Because this murder was committed for financial gain and involved a vulnerable victim, it met the legal criteria for capital punishment. Ed was finally convicted and sentenced to death, just as he had wanted. However, before the state could carry out the execution, Ed Edwards died of natural causes in a prison hospital in 2011 at the age of 77. But the story of Ed Edelum does not end with his death. Since his passing, cold case investigators, journalists, and even members of his own family, including April, have spent years looking into his life. They have realized that Ed Edwards is almost certainly responsible for many more killings beyond the 5 that he officially confessed to. In fact, some investigators have put forward a highly compelling and terrifying theory. They believe that Ed Edwards may actually be the infamous Zodiac killer, one of the most notorious and elusive serial killers in American history, who terrorized Northern California in the late 1960s and early 1970s, claiming to have killed 37 people. While this theory has never been officially proven, the timelines, geographical locations, and psychological profiles of Ed Edwards and the Zodiac Killer match up in ways that are deeply unsettling. If this theory is indeed true, it means that when Ed Edwards walked out onto the stage of To Tell the Truth in October of 1972, stood in front of the flashing television lights, smiled warmly at the celebrity judges, and answered their questions with charm and confidence, he was not a reformed man at all. He was actively a highly prolific, active serial killer who had already taken the lives of dozens of innocent people. He was hiding his true, monstrous nature in plain sight, using a national television broadcast to show off his ability to lie and manipulate. Ed Edwards stopped confessing to murders after his third confession because he had gotten exactly what he wanted, which was the death penalty. Once he secured that sentence, he went completely silent, refusing to cooperate or share any more details about his past. And now that he is dead, the secrets of his true crimes have been buried with him. Without his cooperation, and with so many decades having passed, it is highly unlikely that investigators will ever be able to connect him to other unsolved cold cases. The families of his potential victims are left with unanswered questions, and we will likely never know the true, horrifying extent of Ed Edwards' reign of terror. These three stories show us that the world is full of strange, dark, and mysterious events that we can barely begin to comprehend. From a woman whose own body brewed alcohol, to a brilliant detective who hunted himself down, to a serial killer who stood smiling on a national television stage, the truth is often far more unbelievable than any fiction we could ever write. We must always remember to look closely at the details of our lives, because sometimes the most shocking revelations are hiding in the things we take for granted. Olivia had no idea that her simple love for bread and pasta was triggering a chemical factory in her stomach. Detective Robert Ladrew spent a lifetime solving the secrets of other people, only to realize his own sleeping body was carrying out a quiet tragedy on a lonely beach. And April Blasio had to grow up in the shadow of a father whose public life was an inspiring story of redemption, while his private life was a trail of blood and deception. These stories leave us with a lingering sense of mystery and a reminder that human behavior is complex, unpredictable, and sometimes deeply haunting. We are left to wonder about the secrets that still remain buried, the mysteries that have never been solved, and the quiet truths that are still waiting in the dark to be discovered. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In 1986, life for the Andrews family was turned completely upside down. The two teenage sisters, Annie and Jessica, suddenly and tragically lost their mother to cancer. Her death was fairly abrupt, and it caught everyone by surprise, leaving a huge hole in the family. After she was gone, Annie and Jessica lived full-time with their father, Brian. Now, Brian had always been a hard worker, but with the loss of his wife, he had to take on even more hours just to make ends meet and provide for his two daughters. The general has intensive. He was a single father now, and the weight of that was immense. For Annie and Jessica, the loss was devastating. They had been incredibly close with their mom, and now, with their dad gone at work so often, the house felt quiet and empty. The two sisters were left alone a lot, just them and their thoughts, and all they could think about was how much they missed their mother. The grief was a constant, heavy presence in the house. So one night, while Brian was out on a late shift, the girls came up with an idea. They decided they would try to use a Ouija board to contact their mom. They would later admit they didn't really expect anything to happen, but they were just so desperate for some kind of connection, any sign that she was still with them. They went down into the basement and found the old board game. They set it up, but they didn't really do any research on how a seance was supposed to work. They just sat down, put their hands on the planchette, and started asking simple questions. They asked if their mother was there. They asked if she could give them a sign. For a couple of hours, they sat there in the quiet basement, focusing all their energy on their mom. And of course, nothing really happened. The planchette didn't move on its own. There were no strange noises or flickering lights. Eventually, they decided to put the board away. But in a way, the whole experience was cathartic for them. It gave them a chance to just sit and think about their mom, to talk to her, and to imagine that maybe, just maybe, she could hear them. Even if it was just in their heads, it made them feel closer to her for a little while. So, feeling a bit better, they put the Ouija board away and went back upstairs. They had a quiet rest of the evening and eventually decided to just head to bed. Their father still wasn't home, but this was normal. They were used to it. Annie and Jessica went to their separate bedrooms, and as they were lying there in the dark trying to fall asleep, they both started to hear something. It was a faint tapping sound. At first, they probably thought they were imagining it. But the sound was persistent. It seemed to be coming from inside the walls. Jessica got up and quietly went into Annie's room. She whispered, asking if Annie heard the tapping too. And Annie said yes, she did. They sat there together, listening intently. The house would fall silent, and then it would start again. A soft, rhythmic tapping from somewhere deep within the structure of the house. They had never heard anything like it before. Now, these two girls were grieving deeply. Their minds immediately went back to the seance they had just performed. Could it be? Was this the sign they had asked for? They wanted to believe it so badly. They started whispering to each other that it must be their mom. She was trying to get in touch with them. The seance must have actually worked. And so, what started as a potentially scary sound turned into something hopeful. They started asking questions out loud into the empty room. They asked, "Mom, are you here with us right now?" They asked if she could show herself, if she was okay, if she was watching over them. It was a strange mix of fear and comfort. The idea of a spirit in their house was unsettling, but the thought that it was their mother's spirit there to look after them was deeply reassuring. When their father, Brian, finally got home from work that night, the tapping had stopped. The girls rushed to tell him what happened. They were excited, not scared. They told him about the Ouija board and then about the tapping sounds in the walls, convinced it was their mom. Brian was exhausted. He'd worked a long day, and he was still processing his own grief over losing his wife. He listened to his daughters, and his heart broke for them. He was sure they were just making it up, a product of their grief and their desire to have their mother back. He thought, they're struggling, they miss their mom so much, and this is how it's coming out. That first night, he even considered getting them into some kind of therapy or grief counseling, not because he was angry, but because he was worried. He saw this as a clear sign that they weren't coping well. But for now, he just tried to calm them down. He told them, "Look, girls, just go back to bed. I'm sure she's looking out for all of us." He didn't want to dismiss their feelings entirely, but he also didn't want to encourage what he saw as a fantasy. So, the girls went back to their rooms, and Brian didn't think too much more of it that night. He was just a tired, grieving father worried about his kids. But the tapping didn't stop. Over the next several days, it continued, and it actually started to get more frequent. It got so persistent that it began to disturb the girls' sleep. Night after night, they would lie awake, listening to the tapping inside the walls. And every time they would get scared and call for their father to come check on it, the moment he would step into the room, the tapping would stop. It was maddening for them. It made them feel like they were going crazy. Then, other strange things started to happen. When the family would leave the house for the day, for school or work, they would come back to find things out of place. It was always small things, subtle changes. A piece of furniture would be moved just slightly from its original position. Some of the silverware in the kitchen drawer would be rearranged. Little objects on shelves would be shifted around. It was just enough to be noticeable, to create a feeling that someone or something had been there while they were gone. Of course, Annie and Jessica were convinced it was the spirit of their mother. But Brian was having none of it. He sat them down and told them firmly that this had to stop. He said, "Guys, I know this is you. I know how much you miss your mom, and I know you want this to be real. You want her to be here with us, but she's not. You have to stop moving the furniture around. This whole ghost thing is not healthy." He warned them that if it continued, he was going to insist they start seeing a grief counselor. For the girls, this was a terrible blow. They were adamant that it wasn't them. They were genuinely scared now. And the fact that their own father didn't believe them made them feel completely alone. The initial comfort they had felt, the belief that it was their mother, was starting to fade. This didn't feel like something their mom would do. Moving things around, playing games, trying to scare them, it felt more sinister. They started to think that maybe when they used that Ouija board, they had let something else in. Something evil. And now it was in their house, terrorizing them, and there was nothing they could do because the one person who was supposed to protect them thought they were making it all up. One evening in January of 1987, a few weeks into this strange ordeal, the girls were together in the front room of the house. And they started to hear the tapping sounds again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the walls around them. It sounded like it was coming from the basement. After weeks of being scared and feeling helpless, something inside them snapped. They felt a sudden surge of confidence, or maybe just desperation. They decided they were going to go down there and confront whatever this thing was. Their father wasn't home to help, and he wouldn't believe them anyway. They had to face this on their own. So they took a deep breath and headed for the basement stairs. As they went down, the tapping stopped. The basement was quiet and still. They looked around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. They couldn't find any source for the noise. Feeling a little bit foolish, like they were on a ghost hunt that had led nowhere, they turned to go back upstairs. But as they did, they saw it. Scrawled on the basement wall in what looked like red paint or marker were the words, "Come find me. I'm in your closet." They froze. This was different. This was terrifying. It was no longer just tapping or moved furniture. This was a direct message. It was confirmation that something was actively messing with them, taunting them. It wasn't their mother. This felt like a threat. The girls didn't hesitate. They screamed and ran out of the basement, out of the house, and straight next door to their neighbors. They pounded on the door, hysterical, and told their neighbors that something weird was happening in their house. They tried to explain about the writing on the wall, but they were probably not making much sense. The neighbors, seeing how genuinely terrified they were, let them in and told them to just wait there until their father got home. A little while later, they saw Brian's car pull into the driveway. They ran out and flagged him down, and he came over to the neighbor's house. The neighbor pulled Brian aside and explained what had happened, that the girls had come over in a complete panic. Annie and Jessica then told their dad that there was writing on the wall in the basement. Brian's first reaction was frustration. This was just too much. He thought now they're defacing the property to keep this fantasy going. For him, this was the line. It had gone from a coping mechanism to something totally unhealthy. Still, he went over to the house with them to see for himself. He went down into the basement, and there it was, just as they had described. Red writing on the wall. But instead of being scared, he was just angry at his daughters. He immediately ordered them to start grief counseling. This was no longer a suggestion, it was a demand. And so they began seeing a therapist. And for a while, it seemed to work. For several weeks after that incident, the house was completely silent. There was no tapping. Nothing was ever out of place. It was almost like whatever had been haunting them had just given up and left. Then, one night, Brian was working late again and the girls were home alone. They were sitting together in the front room, enjoying the peace and quiet they had finally gotten back. And then, they heard it. The tapping. It was back. They got up and slowly, cautiously made their way through the house, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It led them to Annie's bedroom. When they opened the door and looked inside, their hearts sank. Written on her bedroom wall were new words. I'm back. Find me if you can. It was happening all over again. They did the only thing they could think to do. They ran. They fled the house and went straight back to the same neighbor's house. They explained that it had happened again, begging the neighbor to believe them. The neighbor let them stay, and they all waited for Brian to come home. When he arrived, the same scene played out. He was flagged down and brought over to the neighbors. This time, when he heard the story, Brian was furious. He confronted the girls, saying, I put you in counseling. I told you to stop doing this. This is not okay. He was at his wit's end. He then told the girls and the neighbor to stay right where they were. He was going to go into that house himself and search it from top to bottom. He was going to prove to them, once and for all, that there was nothing to be afraid of. So he marched back over to his own house, unlocked the front door, and stepped inside. And he stopped dead in his tracks. The house was in total disarray. It looked like it had been completely ransacked. Furniture was overturned, drawers were pulled out, things were thrown everywhere. And his first thought was, the girls didn't do this. Someone else had been in his house. Suddenly, he was on edge. The anger was gone, replaced by a cold fear. He walked cautiously through the trashed rooms, listening for any sound, but it was silent. He made his way upstairs to Annie's bedroom. He saw the writing on the wall, just as they had described. And then he looked towards the closet, and he saw a man standing there. The man was wearing women's clothes. In fact, they were his dead wife's clothes. He was also wearing a wig and carrying a small hatchet. This figure, this man in a dress, was just standing in the closet, staring at Brian. Brian was completely startled. For a second, he was just frozen. Then, the man in the dress started running. He charged out of the closet, and Brian, reacting on instinct, tried to grab him to fight him, but the man was fast and managed to push past Brian and run out of the room. Brian, shaken but now filled with adrenaline, started chasing after him. But the guy was quick. By the time Brian got downstairs, the man was gone. He searched the house frantically, but there was no sign of him. Realizing the man had a hatchet, Brian decided the safest thing to do was get out. He ran out of the house back to his neighbors and yelled for them to call 911. There was an intruder. He stayed with his daughters while the police arrived. They went into the house and conducted a thorough search. They looked everywhere, but they couldn't find anyone. They told Brian that they were sure someone had been there based on his very convincing story and the state of the house, but the person was long gone now. There wasn't much they could do other than advise him not to stay there that night. They said they would keep an eye on the house, do some patrols, but until the intruder was caught, it wasn't safe for the family to be there. And so, the family was left with no answers. Who was that person? How did he get in? And more importantly, how did he get away? Brian was racking his brain. A man in a dress carrying a hatchet is a pretty distinctive sight. How could he just vanish into the neighborhood without anyone seeing him? For the next 2 weeks, Brian and his daughters stayed with relatives. It was a horrible, traumatizing time. Brian was consumed with guilt. He felt like a terrible father. He had left his girls alone night after night in a house with some crazy person living inside of it. He had never believed them. He kept thinking about what could have happened and how it would have been all his fault. The girls were equally traumatized. They now knew that for weeks they had been interacting with a real, dangerous person who was hiding in their home, a person with an axe. But after 2 weeks, living with relatives in a cramped space was getting difficult. And at this point, they reasoned that whoever that man was, he must be long gone. The police were watching the house. They decided it was time to go home. They would get a new security system, be more careful, but they had to get back to their lives. So they packed up their things and headed back. As Brian was driving up his own street, he looked at his house and he noticed something odd. There was a light on in one of the second-floor windows. He thought that was strange. He knew the police were patrolling the neighborhood, but he didn't think they were actually inside his house. As he was looking up at that window, about to pull into his driveway, he saw him. The man in the dress. He walked right past the window, clear as day. Brian slammed on the brakes. He immediately grabbed his daughters, made sure they were safe, and called the police again. This time, he knew the man was still inside. Police were there in seconds. They surrounded the house completely. There was no way anyone was getting out this time. With the house completely surrounded, the police finally made their entry. No one had been inside that house since Brian and the girls had left 2 weeks prior. They had locked it up tight. When the officers opened the front door, they were met with a bizarre and disturbing scene. Not only was all the furniture flipped upside down and moved all over the place again, but there were pennies glued to the ceiling, hundreds of them just stuck up there. And there was red writing everywhere on all the walls in strange, cryptic messages. The police searched the entire house again, top to bottom. But just like before, they didn't find anyone. They were about to conclude that the person had somehow slipped away again, but one of the officers who was searching the basement noticed something. He saw a small piece of wood that looked like it was covering a crawl space behind the washer and dryer. He found that he could move the appliances aside fairly easily. Behind them was a board. When he pulled the board away, it revealed the entrance to a dark, narrow crawl space. Inside this crawl space, the police made a shocking discovery. Someone had burrowed tunnels through the insulation, creating a hidden network that ran throughout the entire house inside the walls. There were small peepholes drilled into the walls in almost every room, allowing whoever was in there to look out and see everything that was going on. And as they followed this intricate maze of tunnels, they found him. Hiding deep within the walls of the house was Danny LaPlante. It turns out Danny was a teenager who had briefly dated Annie. After they had broken up, he had secretly snuck into their house and had been living in their walls for months. He had been listening to every conversation. He heard them talking about their mother's passing. He watched them through the peepholes as they performed the seance with the Ouija board. And he used all of that information to orchestrate the entire haunting. He was the one tapping on the walls. He was the one writing messages with ketchup. He would sneak out at night when they were asleep or when the house was empty to move the furniture around, and then he would slip back into his hiding spot. After Danny LaPlante was pulled out of the crawl space, he was arrested and placed in a juvenile detention center. But the story doesn't end there. Later, in 1987, after he was released, for reasons that nobody really understands, Danny broke into another family's home. And this time, he murdered almost the entire family in cold blood. The idea of someone living in your walls for months is horrifying enough. But to know that it was a psychopath like Danny LaPlante takes it to another level. That final scene, when the police go in and find the pennies glued to the ceiling and the writing everywhere before finding him in that hidden crawl space, it's like something straight out of a horror movie. It's so bizarre, it almost doesn't seem real. But it was. And you just have to think about the trauma that the Andrews family went through. Not just the loss of their mother, but then this terrifying ordeal and the horrifying realization of what could have happened to them. They were living with a future murderer and they never even knew it. It's a kind of deep-seated trauma that you can only hope they were somehow able to recover from. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. In 2006, a young man named Dave Murphy had just achieved a lifelong goal. He had become a police officer in Salt Lake City, Utah. Like any rookie, he was eager to get started, to put his training to use. His very first assignment was as a protective service officer. This role was all about providing physical security for a number of county-owned facilities. It wasn't exactly chasing down bad guys, but it was an important job, and for Dave, it was the first step in his new career. The first facility he was assigned to was the Capital City Theater. This wasn't just any building, it was a landmark in Salt Lake City. It had been standing since the early 1900s, a beautiful, grand, old theater with a rich history. And it was about to become a huge part of Dave's life, in ways he never could have imagined. So, in early August of that year, Dave reported to the Capital City Theater for his first day on the job. He was a little nervous, a little excited, ready to learn the ropes. The first person he met was his partner, an officer by the name of Morgan Matthews. Dave walked in, ready to introduce himself and get to know the guy he'd be spending his nights with. But right away, Dave could tell that Morgan was strictly business. There was no friendly chatter, no welcome to the team. Morgan was all pro, a bit cold, and seemed focused on one thing, the job. The very first thing Morgan did was take Dave to the control room. This room was the nerve center of the theater's security, and it was located on the first floor. The theater itself was a big place, with 3 main floors and a full basement. Inside the control room, a bank of monitors flickered, displaying feeds from security cameras positioned all over the building. Morgan explained that the cameras were old, though. Their quality was poor. You could really only make out what was happening on screen if a light was on in that specific area. At night, when most of the lights were off, the screens were just fuzzy patches of black and gray. It wasn't an ideal system, but it was what they had. After the brief tour of the control room, Morgan turned to Dave. He said, "Now we're going to go do our rounds." He explained that this was a mandatory procedure. Every single shift, at the very beginning and at the very end, they had to do a full security sweep of the entire building. They had to check every door, make sure every light that was supposed to be off was off, and ensure the entire theater was secure before they could settle in for the night or head home. Morgan led the way, and their first stop was the basement. Dave followed him down a set of stairs, and the moment they stepped onto the basement level, Dave was taken aback. The place was huge. It wasn't just a small storage area, it was a massive, long hallway that stretched out into the dimness seemingly forever. The lighting down there was poor, just a few bare bulbs casting long, eerie shadows. Everything in the building was old, and you could really feel the age of the place in the basement. Right in the middle of this vast, empty hallway, there was a piano. It was just sitting there, a dark, silent shape that seemed completely out of place. Dave remembered thinking how incredibly creepy the whole scene was. This long, shadowy hallway with all these closed doors lining the walls, and this lone piano in the center of it all. An immediate, uneasy feeling settled in his stomach. He thought to himself that he really did not want to spend much time down here. But it was part of the job. So, he and Morgan walked the entire length of the hall. They checked every single door, making sure it was locked tight. They then made their way back up, systematically clearing the main floor, then the second floor, and finally the third floor. They checked every room, every closet, every corner. Everything was secure. After the round was complete, they returned to the control room. Dave was hoping that now, with the initial tour out of the way, he might get to know Morgan a bit. This was his partner, after all. They were going to be relying on each other for long hours in this empty building. But Morgan remained cold and distant. He barely spoke to Dave, offering only short, direct answers to any questions. It was clear he did not want to make small talk. And as their shift neared its end, Dave noticed that Morgan seemed almost desperate to get the final security round over with and just get out of the building. At the end of that first night, Dave drove home with a strange feeling. There was just something off about Morgan's behavior. It wasn't just that he was quiet, it was more than that. It felt like Morgan genuinely hated being in that theater. Dave had a gut feeling he was onto something. And it would turn out he was absolutely right. Morgan did not like being in that building, but it would take a little while before he was willing to tell Dave the reason why. For the next couple of days, Dave and Morgan did their security rounds together. Dave was still in training, so Morgan was showing him the exact procedure for securing every part of the massive building. Then, on August 9th, just 2 days after Dave's first shift, Morgan decided Dave was ready to handle it on his own. At the end of their shift, as it was time for the final sweep, Morgan told Dave to do the security round by himself. Dave felt confident. He'd done it a few times now and knew the layout. He started in the basement, just like they always did. He walked down that long, creepy hall, checking each door handle, making sure the lights were off. He finished the basement and went up to the first floor where the control room was. He checked all the rooms there, then moved into the main auditorium space. He walked through the rows of empty seats, checking all the little nooks and crannies to make sure no one was hiding out. From there, he went up to the second floor. He checked the rooms there, walked along the balcony overlooking the stage, and then made his way to the third and final floor. The third floor housed the offices for the theater's staff. At the very end of his search, the last room he needed to check was the rehearsal room. This room was a bit different from the others. It didn't have a door. It was just an open doorway. The procedure was simple: poke your head in, look around to make sure it was empty, and then move on. So Dave gets to the rehearsal room. He reaches in and flips the light switch on. The room floods with light. He scans it quickly. It's empty. Satisfied, he flips the light back off and turns to head back into the hallway to finish his shift. But just as he's turning, he hears an incredibly loud noise. A door right across the hallway from him slams shut with tremendous force. It was the bathroom door. His police instincts kicked in immediately. His first thought was that someone must have been hiding in the building. They had been in the bathroom, saw him coming, and made a run for it, slamming the door behind them as they tried to escape. He instinctively grabbed his radio. He called down to Morgan in the control room, his voice tense. "Someone's on the third floor," he said. Morgan immediately looked at the camera feed for the third floor hallway. But he didn't see anyone. The hallway was empty. Back on the third floor, Dave had already drawn his weapon. He was looking up and down the long hall, but he saw nothing. As he stood there, waiting for Morgan to come up and provide backup so they could search for this person, two things suddenly clicked in his mind. First, just because he heard the door slam didn't mean the person had run out. They could still be inside the bathroom. Maybe they slammed it from the inside to hide. He thought to himself, that's why Morgan can't see them on the camera. They're still in there. The second thing he realized sent a chill down his spine. That bathroom door, it couldn't slam. It was a heavy door fitted with a big, powerful hydraulic hinge, the kind that makes a door close slowly and silently. It was physically impossible for it to slam shut with that kind of force. His gun was now aimed directly at the bathroom door. A moment later, Morgan came up the stairs and appeared at his side. He saw the situation and drew his own pistol, aiming it at the door as well. They wordlessly agreed on a plan. On a count, they made entry, bursting into the bathroom, ready for a confrontation. They cleared every stall, every corner. But there was no one there. And there was no other way out. No windows, no vents big enough for a person. It was a dead end. Morgan and Dave were baffled. They figured the person must have run out after all and was now hiding somewhere else in the theater. They decided they weren't going to worry about how the door managed to slam. They just knew they had an intruder to find. So, with their guns still drawn, they left the bathroom and began a systematic search of the third floor. They checked every office, every closet. Every single door was still locked, just as Dave had left them. As they started making their way down the stairs to the second floor, Dave noticed something through the window in the stairwell door. The lights on the second floor were on. He remembered distinctly turning them all off just a few minutes ago. As they were walking down the stairs, he asked Morgan, "Hey, did you turn the lights on the second floor?" Morgan said no, he hadn't touched a thing. Their intruder, they thought, must be on the second floor. They must have turned the lights on. They pushed through the door, ready for anything. And they found that not only were all the lights on, but every single door on the second floor had been opened. Doors that Dave had personally checked and closed just minutes before were now standing wide open. They searched the entire second floor, room by room. They found nothing. No one was there. They methodically went through, turning off all the lights again and shutting and locking all the doors. They went down to the first floor. Everything there was exactly as it should be, lights off, doors locked. Then they descended back into the creepy basement. The tension was high now. They had searched almost the entire building and were expecting to finally come face to face with whoever was playing these games with them. But they found no one in the basement either. The entire theater was empty. Confused and on edge, they went back to the control room. They decided to review the security footage from the third floor, hoping to catch a glimpse of someone running down the hall when the door slammed. But the camera angle wasn't great. It was pointed down the hall, but you couldn't see the bathroom door itself. And of course, the hallway was dark, and the old cameras were useless without light. All they could see on the footage was the light from the rehearsal room turning on as Dave did his check. Then, a few seconds later, the light turned off. The screen went nearly black. And then, through the audio feed, they heard it. A massive, echoing slam. But they couldn't see what caused it. They had no explanation. They were both on edge, convinced someone could still be hiding somewhere. They did another full sweep of the entire building, just to be sure. Again, they found nothing. In the end, they had no choice but to chalk it up to something strange and unexplainable. Maybe they were just hearing things, seeing things. They decided to just get out of there and go home. A couple of days later, on August 11th, Morgan was working a shift alone. Dave had the night off. Morgan was sitting in the control room monitoring the quiet building when he thought he heard something. It sounded like whispering coming from the hallway just behind him. After the experience with the slamming door a few nights earlier, he was already on high alert. He didn't hesitate. He drew his pistol and stood up. He stepped out into the hallway, and as soon as he did, the whispering sound seemed to move, getting farther and farther away from him down the hall. He looked around, but the hall was empty. He cautiously made his way down the hallway towards the main stairwell that led either up to the second floor or down into the basement. When he got to the top of the stairs, guns still raised, he listened. And that's when he heard a new sound. It was the distinct sound of someone coughing, and it was coming from the basement. At this point, Morgan would later admit that he was genuinely scared. Imagine being all alone in this massive old theater. Just a few days ago, you had a bizarre experience with slamming doors and mysterious open rooms, something another police officer witnessed with you. Now, you're by yourself, hearing voices and coughing coming from the creepiest part of the building. It was terrifying. He very slowly started to make his way down the stairs, his heart pounding. He was getting ready to clear the corner and confront whoever was down there. But just as he reached the bottom of the stairwell, the coughing stopped. He flipped on the lights for the basement hall. He looked down the long, empty corridor. There was nothing there. He started making his way down the hall, checking every door, just like he and Dave always did. He got all the way to the far end of the basement, and as he was finishing his check, he suddenly smelled smoke. A strong, distinct smell of something burning. It was coming from a door right next to him. Thinking there was a fire, he quickly unlocked the door and went inside. But the room was empty. There was no fire. He turned the light on, looked everywhere, but there was nothing burning. The smell of smoke, however, was overwhelming. He was now convinced that there had to be a fire somewhere in the basement. He started going into every single room, one by one, searching for the source. But he found nothing. And then, as mysteriously as it had started, the smell of smoke just dissipated. It was gone. He did a full check of the entire theater, every floor, every room, looking for any sign of a fire. There was nothing. He thought about calling the fire department, but what would he tell them? That he smelled smoke for a few minutes, but now there's no fire? He checked the building 3 or 4 more times just to be absolutely sure. Confident there was no fire, he just had to accept that he couldn't explain it. He was smelling things that weren't there. A few weeks went by. On September 4th, Dave arrived for his shift a little early. It started at 5 p.m., but he got to the theater around 4:30. As he walked in, he saw 3 staff members sitting at the front desk, just chatting. As he walked past, he overheard one of them talking about ghosts inside the theater. This immediately got his attention. He walked over to the man who was talking and introduced himself. The man's name was Blair Fuller, and he was a senior accountant for the theater. Dave told him that he handled security for the building and that he had experienced some strange things himself. He asked Blair if he would be willing to share what he knew. Blair agreed, and they headed up to his office on the 3rd floor. They sat down, and Blair said, "Okay, I've got a doozy for you." He told Dave that a couple of years ago he had been working late in this very office. It was about 9 or 10 o'clock at night. As he was working, he heard the building's elevator kick on. The elevator was right outside his office, and it was an old, loud machine. It was really obvious whenever it was moving. He didn't think much of it at first. But then it clicked. He was the only person in the entire building. He looked out through the glass window of his office door. He could see the little lights above the elevator door that showed which floor it was on. The lights were lit up, and they were moving. The elevator was coming up from the basement. It passed the 1st floor, then the 2nd. Finally, it arrived at the 3rd floor. The doors slid open. There was no one inside. Blair said that at this point, he still wasn't too concerned. He figured maybe it was some kind of scheduled maintenance or an automatic cycle it ran at night. But after a little while, a loud alarm started going off in the elevator. It was the alarm that sounds when something is blocking the door, preventing it from closing. He looked out his office window again. He could hear the ringing sound, but he could clearly see that there was nothing obstructing the doorway. The doors were just stuck open. Curious, he left his office and walked over to the elevator. He stepped inside. He said that the moment he set foot in the elevator car, he felt a massive sudden drop in temperature. It was ice cold inside. As he was standing there, he turned around to look back towards his office. And then the elevator doors started to close. He said that for whatever reason, he didn't step out. He just decided to ride it out and see what happened. As soon as the doors closed, the button for the basement lit up, as if someone had pressed it. The elevator began its descent. He was just standing there thinking about how bizarre this all was. The elevator was malfunctioning with an alarm just a moment ago, and now, as soon as he got inside, it was working perfectly and taking him to the basement. The elevator reached the basement, and the doors opened. There was no one there. Blair said it took all of his courage, but he called out, "Hey, is anyone down here?" He was met with total silence. As soon as he realized no one was going to answer, he said he didn't want to make another sound. He was standing in the elevator in the middle of that long, dark basement hall with the piano sitting out in the middle of it. The lights in the hall were off, and the only light was spilling out from the elevator car. He poked his head out and looked one way. Nothing. He looked the other way. Nothing but the faint outline of the piano. At this point, he was completely spooked. He jumped back into the elevator and started frantically pressing the button for the third floor. He was hitting the door close button over and over. The doors finally shut, and the elevator took him back up to his office. He rushed into his office, shut the door behind him, and sat down at his desk, his mind racing. He was trying to rationalize what had just happened. As he was sitting there, trying to calm down, he heard a new noise. It sounded like banging, coming from just outside his office in the foyer area near the elevator. He got up, went to his door, and cautiously opened it. He peeked his head out and looked to the side. There was a big heavy metal filing cabinet there, and all of its drawers were pulled wide open. He definitely had not done that. And as he watched, one by one, the heavy drawers began to slam shut on their own. Bang. 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 One after another until the entire cabinet was closed. He walked over to it, trying to disprove what he had just seen. He thought maybe there was a problem with the drawers, that they would just shut on their own. But he opened one, and it stayed open. He had to physically push it for it to close. Something, or someone, had just slammed them all shut. That was it for him. He packed up his things, left the theater, and swore he would never work another night shift there again. Later that night, Dave told Morgan the story that Blair had shared with him. He wasn't sure how Morgan would react, if he'd be dismissive. But, to his surprise, Morgan opened up. He told Dave that long before Dave had started working there, he had always had this uncomfortable feeling in the theater, like he was constantly being watched. And then he reminded Dave of their shared experience with the slamming bathroom door and the lights on the second floor. Then Morgan told him about his solo shift. He described hearing the voices in the hall, the coughing from the basement, and the inexplicable smell of smoke when there was no fire. They started going back and forth, sharing all the strange, unsettling things they had experienced in that building. They both felt deeply uncomfortable there, and they realized they needed to do something. Dave came up with an idea. He said he had a best friend he could invite over one night. They would tell him they were just giving him a special behind-the-scenes tour of the historic theater. They wouldn't tell him about any of the strange events. They would just walk him through and see if he noticed anything, if he reacted to anything. It would be a way to see if they were just imagining things, to get an outside perspective. Morgan thought it was a good idea. So Dave called his best friend, a guy named Greg. Greg would later say he was a bit surprised to get an invitation for a late-night tour of the theater, but he was curious. Since it was his best friend asking, he agreed to come down and check it out. The next day, Greg showed up at the theater where Dave and Morgan were on shift. They started the tour. They showed him the main auditorium, the stage, the dressing rooms. Then they made their way down to the basement. Morgan went first and flipped on the lights. And instantly, both he and Dave saw it. A little way down the hall, on the left, one of the doors was standing open. This was a huge red flag. No doors were ever left open. Dave and Morgan immediately pushed Greg behind them for safety, and they both drew their pistols, aiming them at the open doorway. Greg stayed back as Dave and Morgan slowly and cautiously advanced down the hall towards the open door. They got right up to the doorway, preparing to push the door open and clear the room. But before they could touch it, the door slammed shut right in front of their faces. Greg, Dave, and Morgan all just stared at it, completely shocked. And before they could even process that, the door handle started rattling violently, as if someone on the other side was desperately trying to get out. After a few seconds, the rattling stopped. The hallway was silent again. Dave and Morgan looked at each other and nodded. They had to go in. Greg was terrified of being left alone in the hallway, so he decided to follow them. The three of them entered the room, Dave and Morgan with their guns raised. It was a small storage room. They flipped on the light. There was no one there. Suddenly, Greg gasped and pointed to a corner of the room. He said, "Someone sitting in the corner?" Dave and Morgan immediately swung their guns towards the corner, but there was nothing there. It was empty. Greg insisted. "I just saw someone sitting there," he said, his voice trembling. It looked like he had a hood on, like a sweatshirt. He was right there. Now, all three of them were completely freaked out. Dave and Morgan had brought Greg there hoping to disprove the strangeness, and instead, it had escalated. All three of them had seen a door slam shut, and Greg was now claiming to have seen a figure in the room. This scared them all badly. They quickly left the room, locked it, shut off the lights, and got out of the basement. Greg said he was done, and left immediately. Dave and Morgan were left standing there wondering what on earth they were supposed to do now. At this point, Dave and Morgan started reporting these strange occurrences. They didn't mention anything about ghosts or hauntings, of course. They framed it as a series of potential break-ins and security breaches. Eventually, the county agreed that something needed to be done and decided to install a brand new, upgraded camera system inside the theater. These new cameras had infrared technology, which meant they could see much more clearly in the dark. The hope was that this new system would finally allow them to catch whoever was breaking in and causing all this trouble. The new cameras were installed on September 15th. That night, Morgan was working alone again. He was sitting in the control room, familiarizing himself with the new system, clicking through the different camera feeds, and testing out the new features. At some point, as he was looking at the monitor for the main auditorium, something caught his eye. It looked like someone might be sitting in one of the seats out in the middle of the empty theater. The camera was zoomed out so he couldn't get a clear look. And since it was his first time using these new cameras, he wasn't sure what was normal and what wasn't. He zoomed the camera in, trying to get a better look. He could now see it more clearly. It was a figure, and it seemed to be wearing a hood or some kind of shroud over its head. It was just sitting there, motionless. And then, it slowly started to turn its head from side to side. As it turned, he could see, clear as day, a set of eyes glowing in the infrared view. And before Morgan could even react, the figure just started to rise up into the air, floating straight up towards the ceiling until it completely disappeared from view. That was it for Morgan. He didn't investigate. He didn't go looking. He was done. He literally quit his job that day. That was his very last shift at the Capital City Theater. A couple of weeks after Morgan quit, Dave was now working alone at the theater. He was in the control room one night when suddenly he heard the sound of a piano playing. There was only one piano in the entire theater. The one in the basement. As a police officer, it was his job to protect the building. He knew he had to go down there and check it out. It could be an intruder. He left the control room, drew his weapon, and started walking towards the basement stairs. As he got closer, the piano music got louder and louder. He made his way down the steps, and just as he was about to round the corner into the main basement hallway, he heard a loud bang. It was the sound of the wooden guard that protects the piano keys slamming shut. And the music stopped. He turned the corner and looked down the long hallway. There was no one there. He flipped on the light. The hall was empty. At that moment, he knew he wasn't going to find anyone. He knew this was the same thing that had been causing all the mayhem in the theater for months. Dave had seen enough. He was done with this place. He went right back upstairs, locked himself in the control room, and stayed there until the end of his shift. The very next day, he went to his sergeant and said, "You can never put me back inside that theater or I will quit," and sure enough, he was transferred. For the next 2 months, the theater didn't have a full-time security officer. Different officers would come in for a few hours here and there, but no one was assigned there permanently. That is, until November 26th. The department found another officer, a veteran cop named Josh Thomas, who agreed to take the full-time post at the theater. On November 26th, Josh Thomas reported for his very first shift. Because there had been no permanent officer, there was no one there to show him the ropes. He was all alone in the theater. By pure coincidence, Dave happened to be on patrol in his car that night, and his route took him near the theater. At some point during the night, a call came over Dave's radio. It was Josh. He was calling for backup, saying someone had broken into the theater. Dave's heart sank. He knew it probably wasn't a break-in. He knew exactly what was going on in that building. He was the closest unit to the theater, and even though the last thing he ever wanted to do was go back there, he felt a sense of responsibility. He had to go and back Josh up. And if it was what he thought it was, he needed to be the one to explain to this new officer what he was getting himself into. When Dave arrived at the theater, he went to the back door they always used. He saw Josh standing just outside the building. Dave would later say that Josh's eyes were as wide as saucers. He looked absolutely terrified. Dave walked over to him and asked what was going on, if the intruder was still inside. Josh explained that he had been doing his security rounds when he heard what sounded like voices coming from the basement. He checked all the rooms, but everything was secure. Then, as he made his way up to the third floor, he saw that the elevator had turned on. It was coming up from the basement. The light was on, and he could hear it whirring. When the elevator doors opened on his floor, there was no one there. He stood there looking at the empty car, and then the door obstruction alarm started going off. That's when he called for backup. Dave looked at him and said, "Look, let's just go search the building. We'll do it together." They went inside and cleared the entire theater floor by floor. Of course, they found no one. Before Dave left, they went into the main auditorium and stood on the stage, just talking. Dave's back was to the audience seats, and Josh was facing him. Suddenly, in the middle of a sentence, Josh just stopped talking. He froze, and he was staring at something just over Dave's shoulder. Dave asked, "What is it?" And Josh, his voice barely a whisper, said, "There's something behind you." Dave slowly turned around. And as soon as he did, he saw what Josh was looking at. Standing in the very back of the dark theater, in a corner, was a man. His hands were by his sides, and his back was to them. He seemed to be looking down, and he had a hood pulled over his head. Dave turned his whole body to face this figure. And right as he did, the figure whipped around and looked directly at them. It had deep, dark, sunken eyes. Its face looked as if it had been horribly burned. It was black and charred. It stared at them for a second, and then it turned and ran out of a door at the back of the theater. Josh was convinced they had just seen the intruder. Dave was fairly certain they had just seen the entity that haunted the theater. They searched the entire building again, but they never found the cloaked figure. That was when Dave sat Josh down in the control room. He told him everything. He told him about the slamming doors, the voices, the smoke. He told him Blair's story about the elevator and the filing cabinets. He told him why Morgan had quit and why he himself had quit. Josh was now up to speed. Great, he thought. I'm glad I work here now. This was the last time Dave would ever set foot in the Capital City Theater. But his curiosity got the better of him. He started doing some research into the history of the building, and what he found was chilling. It turned out that back in the 1940s, there had been a horrible fire in the theater. A man had been trapped in the basement when the fire erupted. He had died down there. Dave shared this information with Morgan and with Josh, and the three of them, all police officers, all trained to look in strong logical explanations, came to believe the same thing. They believed that what they had been witnessing, what they had seen and heard, was the ghost of the man who died in that fire all those years ago. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.